Chapter 2022. Nanny he walked in from outside and smiled when she saw the scene. They seemed to be getting along well today. She was finally enlightened. She walked over with a smile and asked, "Are you used to being back for a few days?" "Yes." Shin Manting replied and glanced at Nanny he. "I'm fine. We're quite familiar with each other." "It's nothing." "That's good." Nanny he's smile widened and said, "Eldest young master looks much better with you here. He looks energetic today as if he's married." Shin Manting felt that Nanny he's words had a hidden meaning. She smiled and didn't reply. "The baby has obviously behaved a lot these days. I don't see him crying anymore. He used to throw tantrums when I held him. He was very angry just like his father." Nanny he took over and helped her rinse the bottles. "But he's better now. Oh, by the way, I saw old Yang bring back a few boxes of things. They say baby products." "What are they?" "They're for the baby." Shin Manting seemed to have just remembered. "Pack up the bottles. I'll go get them." "Okay, go ahead." Nanny he looked at her with a smile. "Remember to teach me how to use the machines." Shin Manting agreed with a smile. She quickly wiped her hands and unpacked all the baby products she had just bought. The bottles, the disinfectant cabinet and some other things were in a mess. When she was done, she asked Nanny he to help her wash the bottles and then went to install the disinfectant cabinet. There used to be a disinfectant cabinet at home, but the baby's things were getting more and more and more. In addition, Shin Manting also found a room. The room was empty. It used to be her room. Now she asked Nanny he to help her clean up and put the baby products in it. It was already evening when she was finally done. The baby woke up twice and went back to sleep after feeding. Shin Manting was sleepy. When Nanny he went to cook, she took a nap in the baby's room. However, she didn't sleep for long before she heard Nanny he calling her. Shin Manting thought she was dreaming at first, so she didn't pay much attention. Unexpectedly, after a while, she heard old Mrs. Shin's voice. She was startled and immediately opened her eyes. In a flash, the door was opened. When old Mrs. Shin saw Shin Manting, her face was filled with excitement. She looked at her and stomped her foot. "Manting, you're finally back." Old Mrs. Shin's loud voice startled Shin Manting, who hadn't fully woken up yet. She quivered and immediately woke up. But before she could react, she saw the old lady walking towards her. Her arms were wide open and she was about to hug her. Shin Manting felt a little uncomfortable after being hugged. She called out, "Grandma, hey hey hey." Old Mrs. Shin's eyes were filled with tears. She sniffled and shouted, "It's good that you're back. Grandma missed you so much." Shin Manting was flattered and felt a little out of breath from his embrace. She reached out and pushed the baby. Then she heard the sound of the baby crying. Old Mrs. Shin immediately loosened her grip and said, "Look at me. I scared little Moon." Old Mrs. Shin's eyes were filled with tears. She looked at Shin Manting and said, "That's great. Little Moon has a mother now." Shin Manting hurriedly stood up and went to carry the baby over. Chapter 2023. Woo! She looked at Shin Manting, who was pouting and had tears in her eyes. Old Mrs. Shin was unhappy and joked, "Humph, look at this little guy. He knows how to act like a spoiled child now that he has a mother. He used to know how to open his mouth and cry." Shin Manting didn't know why, but when she heard that, she felt a surge of satisfaction. The baby seemed to understand old Mrs. Shin's words. He stopped pouting and opened his mouth to respond. Old Mrs. Shin smiled and felt very emotional. He's finally back. The baby will be very happy in the future with his mother by his side. "Grandma." Shin Manting looked at the old lady and felt a little guilty. What happened before? Old Mrs. Shin was stunned for a moment before she realized that she was probably referring to the incident before the new year when she went to pick her up but returned empty-handed. She smiled warmly and said, "Don't apologize. I understand, but you're not allowed to leave again. If you leave, our family will be incomplete." Shin Manting's heart trembled slightly. She thought she had heard wrong and looked at her. Old Mrs. Shin stepped forward and put her hand on Yi Chanchan's shoulder. She said, "No matter what your identity is, you are a part of our family. This will never change. I will always be your grandmother. Do you hear me?" These words, how could she have never known that her grandmother could be so emotional? Shin Manting couldn't help but nod with tears in her eyes. Old Mrs. Shin was overjoyed. When she saw Shin Manting's reaction, she laughed and said, "Grandma bought a lot of things. Let me show you." Old Mrs. Shin and old Mrs. Dongfang's trip seemed to be very fruitful. She took out a lot of things and kept bragging to Shin Manting. Shin Manting was confused, but she nodded in agreement. Nanny he was very relieved when she saw it. Shun Longyue and Mrs. Shun came back from work together and had a happy meal with the family. It was said that Shin Jilie and Yi Chanshan had gone to Yuntown the day before. It was estimated that it would be some time before they returned to the capital. After dinner, old Mrs. Shun chatted with Shin Longyue, Mrs. Shun, and Shin Manting for a long time. They didn't leave until 9 o'clock in the evening. Shin Manting had just taken a shower and played with the baby for a while when she heard her phone ring. It was Shin Luo-un. Shin Manting glanced at the time. It was already past 10 o'clock. Why didn't he go home? Why did he call her at this hour? When he picked up the phone, he heard the noise of people on the other end. But she did not hear Shin Luo-an's voice. Shin Manting frowned and called out, "Shin Luo-un?" After a few seconds, someone replied, Manting. The drunken voice belonged to Shin Luo-un. Shin Manting had a bad feeling about this. "Are you drunk?" "I'm not drunk," Shin Luo-un said. "I just had a few drinks and can't drive anymore. Come and pick me up." When Shin Manting heard this, she subconsciously glanced at the baby in her arms. "I'm at home looking after the baby. Why don't you call a designated driver? If you don't pick me up, I can't go back." Shin Luo-un was so drunk that he could barely speak. "What? You can take a taxi back. Just leave the car there and drive it back tomorrow." Shin Manting looked at the time. "Is it far from home?" Chapter 2024. Shin Manting felt as if her heart had been struck by something suddenly. It sank suddenly and was so heavy that it rippled. A strange feeling suddenly surrounded her. It was extremely subtle. "Who's your wife?" Shin Manting retorted, but her voice was not loud and soon disappeared. Hearing her reaction, Shin Luo-un laughed foolishly and said, "Come quickly. They've found me. You don't come, I'll be drunk to death here." "Old Shin, you're not being kind. You've only drunk a little and you're calling for help." The clear and loud voice was obviously much more sober than Shin Luo-un. "I'm at Yun on Changde Road." However, before she could hear more, the phone was hung up. Shin Manting looked at the baby in her arms and hesitated for a moment before she went to Shin Longyue's room. Knock knock. After a long time, someone opened the door. Mrs. Shin was sleepy. When she saw Shin Manting, she calmed down and asked, "What's wrong?" Shin Manting told her the whole story and then said, "Why don't you go and pick him up? Or you can ask Dad to go." Shin Manting was a little anxious and didn't notice how she addressed him. Mrs. Shin's face softened, but she remained calm and said, "He went out to socialize and was forced to drink. It's unreasonable for his parents to pick him up. How do you think he'll face his friends in the future? Of course you should go." Then she looked at the baby in her arms and said, "I'll look after the baby. You go." Mrs. Shin's words made sense, but Shin Manting still felt that something was wrong. After thinking about it, she nodded. She handed the baby to her and said worriedly, "It's almost time for the baby to drink milk. Give it to him in 10 minutes. Okay. Then I'll go and change first." Because she had just taken a shower, Shin Manting was wearing pajamas. Now that she was ready to go out, she went back to the nanny's room. She took out the clothes she bought today and picked out a dress. But after thinking about it, it was a dinner party after all, and the people drinking there were all men. What if someone was drunk and messed around? No way. She rummaged around and found a pantsuit that Shin Luo-un had chosen for her. After putting it on, she felt much better. She put on her shoes, carried her bag, took a small comb and combed her hair before walking out. She took a taxi and soon arrived at Changde Road. She told the driver about Misty Cloud, and the driver took her to Misty Cloud Dream. Yen Yun Ru Meng was a luxurious high-end entertainment venue, with restaurants and entertainment as one. She called Shin Luo-un but no one answered. She walked up in her high heels. When she made another call, she saw a familiar man from afar. He looked to be in his 30s or 40s. He was slightly plump and wore a pair of glasses. He looked quite gentle. But now his face was red and he looked a little drunk. "Lao?" Shin Manting walked over and called out, "Where's Shin Luo-un?" Lao Wu looked up and saw Shin Manting. He found her familiar. After a while, he remembered who she was and said, "Oh Manting. You've changed so much that I almost couldn't recognize you." Shin Manting could only smile and ask again, "Where is Shin Luo-un?" "He's still in there. These people are too good at drinking. I can't beat them." Shin Manting waved his hand and looked like he was about to vomit. Shin Manting took a step back and frowned. Shin Manting took a rest for a while, then said drunkenly, "Let's go and save Shin." He stumbled forward and mumbled, "It's not the same, it's not the same." As soon as they entered the private room, there was a strong smell of cigarettes and alcohol. Someone was singing and the table was full of good food and wine. Shin Luo, and was lying on the table, holding a bottle of white wine in his hand. Shin, your woman is here to pick you up, Shin Manting said in a loud voice. Shin Luo, and immediately raised his head and saw Shin Manting from afar. He grinned and said, she's here. As he said that, he supported himself with the bottle and tried to stand up. But his body went limp and he almost fell again. Shin Manting quickly went up and held him steadily. Shin Luo, and slightly turned sideways and hugged her waist. Shin Manting was suddenly hugged and her whole body tightened. Then Shin Luo, and buried his face in her gorgeous hair and inhaled deeply. Shin Manting's face turned red and she took a step back. She whispered anxiously, what are you doing? There are so many people. Hey, if you want to be intimate, go home. A fat man who looked like a boss waved his hand in disgust. How much did you drink? This genius can't hold his liquor well. Take him away. Shin Luo, and didn't seem to hear it. He was a little intoxicated and said with a smile, I missed you so much. Shin Manting's face was a little hot. She pushed his face away and said, let go. Shin Luo, and didn't let go. He reached out and put his hand on her shoulder to help her stand up. How much did you drink? You're like this. Shin Manting frowned and dragged him up. Shin Luo's feet were a little unstable, and then his whole body almost fell on top of her. He looked thin, but he was a man after all, and his weight was not light. Shin Manting staggered under his weight, but she soon straightened up and said angrily, why did you drink so much? It was delicious. Hey, you're too fierce, Lao Wu laughed. Old Shin also has such a day. Women should be gentle. Although old Shin is easy to bully, don't bully your man like this. There are so many people here. You can go home and do whatever you want behind closed doors. Haha, you don't say. Maybe she looks fierce, but she is very gentle in the room. Otherwise, how could old Shin be defeated by her? Shin Manting's face flushed with embarrassment as they teased each other. She stopped talking and put Shin Luo's hand on her shoulder. Then she carried him out of the room. The people in the private room continued to drink, laughing as they watched their backs. Shin Luo was drunk. When he heard their words, the thirst in his heart became stronger. He glanced at Shin Manting's face. It was pink and very tempting. Shin Luo's eyes were fixed on her. He blinked and looked at her, licking his lips. But soon he forced himself to turn his head as if to hypnotize himself and said, let's go home. Shin Manting supported him and muttered, you can't drink. Why did you drink so much? I still have to serve you when we go home. You'll be in trouble if the baby is affected by the smell of alcohol. Shin Luo chuckled. Shin Manting was puzzled by his laughter and asked, where's the car? In the garage. -1 and -2. 2. When they arrived at the garage, Shin Manting held the key for a long time before she found the car. She helped him into the front passenger seat, then went to the driver's seat and buckled the seat belt for him. However, she accidentally met his hazy and blurred eyes. Shin Luo licked his lips. In a flash, he reached out and pinched her chin. He slightly tilted his head and kissed her lips. It's the end of the month. Don't waste your monthly tickets. Give them to me. Chapter 2025. In an instant, Shin Manting's mouth was filled with the strong smell of alcohol and tobacco. She opened her eyes wide in disbelief. She subconsciously broke free from him, but as soon as she stretched out her hand and placed it on his chest, she was pushed back by Shin Luo. Ugh. Shin Manting struggled uneasily and tried to push him away with both hands on his shoulders. However, Shin Luo's arm not only did not loosen, but he squeezed it even tighter. Shin Manting frowned in pain. All the resistance and disgust in her heart broke out at this moment. She closed her mouth forcefully, and immediately her mouth was filled with the smell of blood. Shin Luo frowned and looked at Shin Manting in front of him with a pair of amber eyes. He was a little confused. Shin Manting frowned and used all her strength to push him away. Shin Luo was pushed and his head hit the car window. Bang! It was a clear and dull sound. Shin Manting retched and immediately opened the car door with her hands covering her mouth. She wiped her mouth and blood mixed with saliva. Her mouth was still filled with the smell of alcohol and tobacco. It was so disgusting that it made her want to vomit. After resting for a while, nothing came out of his mouth. Shin Manting turned her head back. However, she found that Shin Luo was still in the same position, motionless. She opened the car door and walked in. Shin Manting reached out and pushed Shin Luo. Shin Luo? But Shin Luo was still motionless. It looked like he was asleep? Or did he just hit the car window and passed out? Shin Luo? Shin Manting felt that something was wrong and she pushed him hard. Still there was no reaction. She reached out and raised his head. At a glance, she saw a bloody luster in the gap of his mouth. Startled, she immediately pulled out a tissue and wiped his mouth. The tissue was full of blood. Did she use too much force just now? Shin Manting's heart inexplicably surged with guilt. He was drunk, but she was sober. Maybe he didn't even know what he was doing. She tried to open his mouth, but his teeth were so tightly clenched that she couldn't open them. Shin Manting had to use the stupidest method to wipe his mouth. After a while, when the traces of blood had lessened, he started the car. She drove home and parked the car in the courtyard. Then she got out of the car and helped him out. Shin Luo and was very heavy, but he was still conscious. His body was pressed against hers, and he knew that he had to move a few steps. He opened his eyes slightly and stared at Shin Manting. Shin Manting felt a little uncomfortable under his gaze. She glared at him and made him lean against the wall before pressing the doorbell. Mrs. Shin quickly came to open the door. Her hands were empty. The baby must have fallen asleep. When he saw Shin Luo and he frowned and said, "Why did you drink so much? You know you can't drink." "Mom, help me make a glass of honey water to sober him up." Shin Manting carried him on her shoulder and resisted the urge to throw him down. Mrs. Shin quickly replied, "I'll help you get him inside first." Shin Luo wasn't in a good state, but as soon as he entered the house, he seemed to be more clear-headed. "Go to sleep," Shin Luo said in a drunken voice. I'll go take a shower first." Mrs. Shin panicked when she heard that. "How can you take a shower in such a state? Go lie down and sleep." "No, I can't. The baby is in there. I smell like alcohol. The baby will feel uncomfortable." Shin Luo had already taken off his suit as he spoke. He let go of Shin Manting and stumbled into the room. Mrs. Shin hurried to hold him, but she was pushed away. Shin Manting watched from behind and felt angry. She said, "Why did you drink so much when you can't drink? Why are you acting like a drunkard now?" Shin Luo looked back and said nothing. However, he suddenly stuck out his tongue and touched it. Shin Manting felt her heart skip a beat when she saw his action. She subconsciously glanced at Mrs. Shin and quickly went up to help Shin Luo into the room. Shin Luo didn't push her away. He was very cooperative. However, as soon as he entered the room, he closed the door. He turned around and pressed Shin Manting against the door. Shin Manting was shocked and said, "What are you doing?" Shin Luo's amber eyes seemed to be covered with a layer of fog. When he heard Shin Manting's voice, he stared at her for a long time before he stuck out his tongue and said, "My tongue hurts." His voice was muffled, but his tongue clearly appeared in front of Shin Manting. Shin Manting glanced at it and squinted at him. She then said, "What does it have to do with me? I just dreamed that you bit me." Shin Luo looked at her with a face full of accusation. Shin Manting glared at him and pushed him away angrily. She shouted, "Don't you know what you've done? How dare you criticize me?" Shin Luo looked dissatisfied and said with a straight face, "You can't." Shin Manting was even more puzzled. She wanted to push him away, but Shin Luo seemed to be very sober. She couldn't push him away at all. "Go away." Shin Manting was annoyed and shouted in a low voice, "The child is still sleeping. Don't force me to quarrel with you." When Shin Luo heard this, his drunken eyes became even redder. He looked at her with a few strands of tears in his eyes. Shin Manting had never seen Shin Luo like this. She was shocked and hurriedly shouted, "What are you doing?" However, Shin Luo seemed to be in great pain and pressed down. Shin Manting was even more shocked. Before she could react, Shin Luo's face was pressed against her shoulder. "I just dreamed that you kissed me." Shin Luo's voice was hazy with drunkenness. His face was pressed against her shoulder, so his voice was also muffled. However, Shin Manting heard it clearly. She pulled her face and pushed his face away with her hand. She said angrily, "Go away." No. Shin Luo didn't go away. He slightly pressed his body against her and said in a choked nasal voice, "I miss you so much. I won't go away." Shin Manting's heart fluttered and she was momentarily stunned. Shin Luo just lay there quietly, his big hand grabbing the clothes around her waist. He bent over and lowered his head. He looked a little embarrassed, reeking of alcohol. He didn't look like Shin Luo at all. Shin Manting looked down at him and gently pushed him away. "You can take a bath now." "I don't want to take a bath." Shin Luo's voice was low and sounded a little coquettish. "You were the one who said you wanted to take a bath just now." Shin Manting felt annoyed. "Get up." Chapter 2026. Shin Manting's voice was low and full of grievance. Shin Manting's heart ached. She subconsciously looked at the baby lying quietly in the crib. The baby and the baby were both in the room. The baby was lying quietly, but the big one was holding on to her tightly. "Don't go, Shinluo," Anne's voice was muffled with a strong nasal sound. "Stay, the baby and I need you." Shin Manting felt a surge of sadness from the back of her head to the tip of her nose. Her eyes were dry and she almost shed tears. Don't go," Shin Manting raised her hand and gently hugged him. She whispered, "Go to sleep first." "Don't go, Shinluo," and seemed to be drunk. He grabbed her clothes and murmured with his head down. He only knew how to repeat this sentence in these few words. "Let go of me first." "Don't go, Shinluo," and "Don't go." Shin Manting's eyes were slightly red. She hugged him and whispered, "Don't go, Shinluo," and seemed to have gotten the answer he wanted. Then, his body loosened and he completely fell on top of her body. Shin Manting was startled. She cried out in alarm and hurriedly supported him. It took her a lot of effort to half support and half drag him to the bed. His body reeked of alcohol. Shin Manting took off his shoes and then began to unbutton his shirt. She poured warm water for him to wipe his hands and face. Finally, after unbuckling his belt, she stuffed him into the innermost part of the bed. Shinluo, and was snoring slightly. It seemed that he was sleeping soundly. Shin Manting sighed heavily. After going to her room to change into a set of pajamas, she brought in the honey water that Mrs. Shen had prepared. After pulling him a few times and finding that she couldn't move him, Shin Manting gave up the idea of pouring him water. She took off her shoes and lay on the bed. She fell asleep in a daze. In the middle of the night, the baby didn't wake her up, but she was awakened by a suffocating feeling. Shinluo, and hugged her tightly in his arms. He used a lot of strength. Shin Manting gasped uncomfortably. She pried his hand away and shouted, "Shinluo, and let go." "Shinluo," Anne's hand was pulled away, and Shin Manting immediately flipped him over. Shin Manting heard the baby crying. She had no choice but to get up and turn on the lights. She fed the baby milk and changed his diaper. When she was about to turn off the lights, she suddenly saw Shinluo, and on the bed staring at her. Shin Manting's heart thumped and she took a step back. When he saw that it was Shinluo, and he heaved a sigh of relief. Then he said angrily, "Are you crazy? It's so silent." Shinluo, and seemed to have lost his soul. He stared at her blankly. Then he got up and said, "I want to go to the toilet." "Go." "I don't have the strength." Shinluo, and sat on the edge of the bed and waited for her to help him up. Shin Manting's eyebrows twitched. When she saw his innocent expression, she wished she could bite him to death. Suppressing his anger, he walked forward. With her help, Shinluo, and stood up and stumbled to the bathroom. Shin Manting helped him to the door and then turned around. The sound of running water could be heard. Shin Manting closed her eyes in disgust and walked out of the bathroom. She didn't know how long it had been, but there was no movement inside. Shin Manting sat on the edge of the bed and shouted, "Shinluo an." No one answered. Then she stood up and looked inside. Unexpectedly, Shinluo, and was sitting in the bathtub with his eyes closed. It seemed that he had fallen asleep. Shin Manting couldn't bear it anymore. She covered her face and scolded, "Damn it." She walked forward and turned on the shower head angrily. Then she poured the shower head on his head. Shinluo, and seemed to be startled. His whole body twitched. Then he opened his eyes and looked at her. He was confused and hazy. There seemed to be some doubt in his eyes. Shin Manting said angrily, "Get up and go back to sleep." Shinluo, Anne's hair was wet. When he heard this, he wiped his hair in confusion. Then he turned his head and took a bottle of shampoo and squeezed it twice. Shin Manting suddenly had a bad feeling. "What are you doing?" As expected, Shinluo, and didn't say anything and rubbed the shampoo on his head. "Oh my God." Shin Manting was going crazy. She immediately reached out and pulled his hand down. She exclaimed, "Shinluo an." Shinluo, and didn't seem to notice anything wrong. He asked in confusion, "What?" Shin Manting was extremely sleepy. When she saw his confused look, her temper seemed to be blocked. She couldn't say anything. She had no choice but to squat down and turn on the hot water. She cursed in a low voice, "I really owe you." She washed the shampoo off his head and squeezed some shampoo into his hair. After washing his hair clean, she pulled the shampoo over. She rubbed it hard on his body as if she was taking revenge. Shinluo, and frowned and pulled her hand. He said in a low and aggrieved voice, "It hurts." He looked as if Shin Manting had done something unforgivable. Shin Manting's heart suddenly softened. She involuntarily loosened her grip. She reached out and unbuttoned his pants. She said angrily, "Take it off yourself." Shin Luo, and tugged twice. Then he clumsily pulled his pants down to his knees and stopped moving. Shin Manting rolled her eyes at the sky. Then she roared, "Are you King drunk or stupid?" Her voice was so loud that the baby woke up in fright. Sobbing sounds could be heard. Shin Manting was shocked. Then she turned around and glared at him. "Go to hell." She threw the disheveled hair on him. Then she stood up and walked in the direction of the baby. The baby opened his eyes helplessly and was at a loss. He looked a little like Shin Luo, and just now. Shin Manting's heart softened slightly. At the same time she felt very annoyed. She patiently coaxed the baby to sleep and gently put him back. She turned around and returned to the bathroom. She saw that Shin Luo and had already washed himself. He had also taken off his pants. At this moment he was holding the shower head with both hands and washing it down his neck. He smiled when he saw her. However, his smile was indescribably silly. Shin Manting snorted. She grabbed a bath towel and turned off the water. Then she covered his head with it. Shin Luo and took off the bath towel. Then he was pulled up by Shin Manting. Shin Manting said, "Come out." Shin Luo and was very obedient. He stepped forward obediently. Shin Manting wiped his body. Inadvertently, she found that there seemed to be some signs of standing on his naked body. She tensed up and looked up at Shin Luo-han. Shin Luo and suddenly reached out and grabbed the bath towel in her hand. He took a step back and said, "Don't peek at me." Chapter 2027. Shin Luo and fell flat on his back. The towel fell to the ground and she lay down on the bed. He didn't even try to hide it. Shin Manting walked over and glanced at him. But it seemed to be an illusion. She blushed and immediately looked away. Pervert. Shin Manting covered him with the blanket, turned off the light and lay down. Shin Manting was exhausted. As soon as she lay down, she closed her eyes and soon fell asleep. She slept with her back to Shin Luo-han. But in the middle of the night, she didn't know if it was an illusion, but she felt that something was rubbing against her. She woke up with a start and turned around. Shin Luo and was lying quietly on the bed. His hand was pressed against the blanket on his waist. Shin Manting yawned and then turned to face him and continued to sleep. Nothing happened until dawn. During this period the baby woke up once but it was quickly resolved. When Shin Manting got up, Shin Luo and was gone. The sound of running water came from the bathroom. Soon Shin Luo and came out in his home clothes, knocking his head. When he saw her he frowned and said, "Did you hit me last night? Why does my head hurt so much?" "You were the one who drank the wine," Shin Manting said angrily. She got up and said, "I really owe you. Not only do I have to serve your son, but I also have to serve you." "Nonsense." Shin Luo and walked over and took her hand to touch his head. "Look, it's swollen." Shin Manting touched his head. It was true. She suddenly remembered that when she threw the shower head last night, she seemed to have thrown it a little hard. How could it be so coincidental that it hit him on the head? She felt a little guilty, but she still said confidently, "It's not my fault." Indeed, it was not her fault. He did it himself. Shin Luo and was skeptical. He stuck out his tongue and said, "Tongue, you bit me." T. Shin Manting denied. "You bit yourself. How is that possible?" Shin Luo and obviously didn't believe her. Shin Manting turned around and said loudly, "You're the one who bit your own tongue. Why are you blaming me for everything? I clearly remember you biting me." Shin Luo and was a little unconvinced. He stepped forward and said, "What did you do when I was drunk? Tell me now." Shin Manting ignored him and walked out the door. Shin Luo and stared at her from behind, his head throbbing with pain. What happened last night was intermittent, so he couldn't remember it clearly, but he didn't forget everything either. Why did he feel like he had suffered a great loss? This feeling was intense, but it felt pretty good. Shin Manting went back to the nanny's room to wash up. But when she looked into the mirror, she felt a little strange. What if you don't want me and the child anymore? His heart palpitated. She didn't know if he was talking nonsense because he was drunk, or if he was telling the truth because he was drunk. Shin Manting washed her face. Her mind was filled with the image of him sitting in the bathtub in a daze. What a fool. Nanny, he had already prepared dinner by the time she got changed. Shin Manting yawned and went back into the house to carry the baby out. Shin Luo and was still sleeping. The more she looked at him, the more annoyed she became. When she passed by, she glared at him resentfully. Shen Luo, and seemed to feel it and sat up immediately. He got up and walked out of the room in his slippers. He knocked his head and said, "Nanny, help me cook some soup to sober up." Nanny glanced at him and then at Shin Manting. She smiled and said, "Wait a minute." After finishing the work in her hands, she went to the kitchen to cook some soup to sober up. Shin Manting sat on the sofa with the baby in her arms and kept yawning. Shen Luo, and glanced at her and sat in front of her. He said angrily, "Didn't I let you sleep last night? You're so sleepy." Shin Manting glanced at him and became even more annoyed. She said, "How dare you say that? Think about what you did last night." Chapter 2028. However, he suddenly recalled his long-awaited reaction last night. Vaguely, he seemed to be hugging a pillow or something and rubbing it a few times. Could it be? Looking at Shin Manting's expression, Shen Luo, and suddenly had a bad feeling. Could it be that the person he rubbed against last night was actually the same person? He felt a little strange, but when he saw Shin Manting's angry expression, he deliberately looked away and said, "Did I kick you off the bed?" Nanny He and Mrs. Shin laughed. Shin Longyue sat at the dining table and looked over. Shin Manting was annoyed by their laughter. She frowned and said, "How dare you say that? Why did you imitate others when you can't drink? Not only were you drunk, but you also lay in the bathtub and refused to get up. If I hadn't sacrificed my sleep time to wake you up, you would have slept in the bathtub all night." After being reminded, Shen Luo, and seemed to have some recollection of it. Seemed he was really drunk. Shen Luo, and felt guilty, but he still refused to admit his mistake. He looked at Shin Manting's face and snorted coldly. "If that's the case, why don't you let me sleep in the bathtub? It's cool and comfortable to sleep in the bathtub." Shin Manting felt that he was unreasonable. She stood up with the baby in her arms and decided to ignore him. Shen Luo, and looked at her and started eating the orange. Nanny He quickly cooked the hangover soup. When she came over, she glared at Shen Luo, and then said, "Can't you say something nice?" "What can I say?" Shen Luo, and was amused. He looked at the bowl of hot soup and said, "I have a headache. Help me get some painkillers." "You'll be fine after drinking some hangover soup. You can lie down later." Nanny He wiped her hands and said, "Eat your breakfast after you're done. Drinking too much is not good for your stomach." "Got it." Shen Luo, and picked up the bowl and drank it with a frown. After a while he went to the table. Shin Manting had already put the baby back. After a night of playing, her stomach was already growling. But when she was about to eat breakfast, she saw Shen Luo, and sitting at the table. She had originally walked out of the room, but she turned back. Shen Luo, and frowned when he saw this, but he didn't say anything. After eating a little, he got up and went back to his room to lie down like a corpse. Shin Manting was packing the baby's clothes into a pile. When she saw Shen Luo, and enter, she carried them to the next room and placed them in the disinfectant cabinet. Shen Luo and could tell. This woman is hiding from me again. Feeling unhappy, she covered her head with the blanket and closed her eyes. But he couldn't fall asleep no matter what. He tossed and turned in bed for a while, trying to recall the scene from last night. But as soon as he thought about it, his head started to hurt. Motherf asterisk her. It turned out that there really was such a thing as blacking out after drinking. His tongue was also in pain. It was obvious that he had bitten it. Wait, I have to sort this out first. Shin Manting looked at him as if she had seen a wolf or a leopard. It was impossible that she had kissed him. Then the only possibility was that he was drunk and kissed her. Then she had bitten him and his tongue still hurt like hell. Furthermore, he vaguely remembered that someone seemed to have touched him last night, and it even caused him to have a reaction. Shen Luo, and thought of this and immediately sat up. Just then the door opened. Chapter 2029. Shin Manting. Shen Luo, and looked at her and suddenly called out. Shin Manting ignored him. She turned on the switch of the small cabinet and put down the small curtain that blocked out the radiation. "I'm calling you. Didn't you hear me?" "Yes." Shin Manting turned around and put away the diapers. "What do you want?" "Come here." "What?" "Because you took advantage of me last night." Shen Luo, and stood up and walked over to her. "I remember I was wearing a lot of clothes last night. When I woke up this morning, I didn't even have my underwear. Did you take advantage of me?" Shin Manting immediately glanced at him with a look of disgust. "Can you be more shameless? I waited on you for a long time last night. You didn't get up from the bathtub and even rub the shower gel on your head. Don't you remember that?" Shen Luo, and immediately frowned. How could such a thing happen? Impossible. He couldn't have done such a thing. It was impossible. Shin Manting twitched the corner of her mouth and turned away. Then why didn't I wear any clothes? I was kind. I helped you take a bath and took off your dirty clothes. My underwear is gone too. Do you like wearing underwear when you take a bath? Shin Manting looked at him strangely. You have to be content. I haven't even questioned you yet. Are you trying to settle the score after drinking? Shin Luo and looked at her and frowned even deeper. He said seriously, I think you're wronging me. Shin Manting was speechless. She ignored him and turned to leave. Shin Luo and looked at her and felt bored. His head was throbbing with pain, so he turned around and lay down. He slept all the way until the afternoon. The baby was not on the small bed. Shin Luo and yawned. He was undoubtedly in a much better state. After washing up, he walked out and found Nanny He watching TV with the baby in her arms. Shin Luo and frowned. Where is she? She went to take a nap. She didn't sleep much last night. Look at her, the dark circles under her eyes are comparable to those of a panda. She's not in the room. Where did she sleep? In her room, of course. Where is the nanny's room? Nanny He pointed in that direction and said, You're the one who's making a scene when you're drunk. It's not easy for Miss to come back. If you drive her away again, let's see how you're going to lure her back. Shin Luo and didn't say anything, but he was obviously unhappy. It's not like there's no bed for her to sleep in. Who is she trying to impress by sleeping in the nanny's room? When Nanny He heard this, she shook her head and clicked her tongue. Didn't she agree to come back because you treated her as a nanny? Isn't it only right for her to sleep in the nanny's room now? She took care of you and the baby last night. It's time for her to rest. Is the nanny's room good to sleep in? It's hard to sleep. It's humid and stuffy. Auntie Zhang complained about it before. It's really uncomfortable. Nanny He raised her eyelids and glanced at him. But we don't have any extra rooms in the house now. She converted young Mrs. Room into a small storage unit for the baby. She even wants to convert it into a nursery. She's adding some things on the side. She said that when the baby turns 1, she'll quit her job as a nanny and find another way to make a living. Did she really say that? Shin Luo and was furious. How did I mistreat her? Chapter 20:30. Bang. The chair next to him fell to the ground. The baby was so scared that he twitched. Then he started to cry with a red face. Nanny He was also shocked by the sudden movement. She opened her eyes and peeked at Shin Luo An's expression. Shin Luo An's expression was very ugly. He glanced at the crying baby and went back to the room with a sullen face. What? Sign a contract? Shin Manting was shocked. What contract? Do you even need to ask? Shin Luo and slapped the paper lazily and said impatiently, It's such a big labor contract. Can't you see it? Shin Manting slapped the paper hard and took the labor contract. She muttered, Is it necessary? You make it sound so serious. Shin Luo and heard her muttering and said, You spoil her. Her temper is getting worse. Shin Manting didn't say anything. She looked at the contract and said, You're giving me a salary of 20,000 yuan? How can a nanny get such a high salary? I like you. I'm willing to give you a higher salary. Shin Luo and glanced at her with a natural expression. Shin Manting's heartbeat quickened when she heard his words. She felt a little uncomfortable and lowered her head to continue reading the contract. 10 years? Shin Manting frowned. No way. Why? Shin Luo and was a little dissatisfied. Are you not satisfied with the salary? Shin Manting frowned. If I work here for 10 years, how can I find a partner? I'm only 28 years old and I still have to find a partner. Do you want me to find one around here? Don't pretend to be young. Shin Luo and felt a burst of irritation and corrected her. You're already 29 years old and you've already given birth to a child. You still want to find a partner? Don't you have any shame? Shin Manting laughed when she heard this. Can't I find a partner after I've given birth? Is there any law? You call this shameless? There are plenty of people selling their bodies on the streets. You want to compare yourself to them? Shin Luoan's eyes were full of contempt. How can you compare? At least they have a good figure and look. Go and look in the mirror. Look at yourself. How can you compare yourself? Shin Manting was even more furious. She flipped the contract over and said, I'm just a normal human being. I have normal needs. I'm different from you. I can live the rest of my life alone. I won't sign this contract. Shin Luoan's face darkened. He looked at the contract that had been swept to the ground and said, Your temper is getting worse. Who would have a good temper when facing your face all day long? Am I not good looking? Don't you have any idea if it's good or not? Shin Luo, Anne's expression darkened. He stood up and reached out to grab her hand. What do you want? I'll satisfy you. Shin Manting's heart skipped a beat when she felt his tug. Let go of me. However, Shin Luo and refused to let go of her. Instead, he reached out and wrapped his arms around her waist. Whether it's material, psychological, or physical, I can satisfy you. Shin Luo, Anne's eyes darkened. It seemed to be enshrouded in a layer of unknown emotions, looking at her quietly and deeply. Shin Manting felt her heart tremble and her face darkened. Let go of me. Shin Manting, I'm good enough for you. You have to be grateful. Shin Manting was so angry that she laughed. She cursed, F***CKU. You're shameless. Get lost. I don't want to stay here anymore. Chapter 2031. Shin Manting suddenly stopped struggling. She gasped and looked at him. Shin Luo, and didn't let go. He looked at her without saying anything. After a long time, Shin Manting said, You can't satisfy me, Shin Luo-un. What do you mean? Shin Luo, and narrowed his eyes and moved his palm up along her waistline. Slowly. The strange feeling made Shin Manting tremble. Her body was slightly stiff. Shin Luo, and could clearly feel his palm rubbing her second forbidden area. Like this? Shin Manting felt conflicted. She closed her eyes and turned her head away, trying to push him away. But Shin Luo, and didn't let her go. Instead, he picked her up. Shin Manting screamed. In the blink of an eye, she was pressed on the bed. The familiar and strange feeling made Shin Manting panic. She screamed, Shin Luo, and let me go. He struggled with all his might with his hands and legs, as if he had used up all his strength. His eyes were slightly red and he was hysterical. She was afraid. When he realized this, Shin Luo, and immediately let go of her. Shin Manting immediately scrambled out of bed and staggered down the stairs. Looking at Shin Luo, and her eyes were red and she was short of breath. But soon she opened the door and ran out. Shin Luo, and turned over and looked at the door. He suddenly felt a deep sense of frustration. Then he couldn't contain his anger. He picked up the contract and quickly tore it into pieces. Then he threw it into the trash can. The shredded paper hit the edge of the trash can and fell to the ground. Mrs. Shun was holding the baby outside. When she heard what sounded like an argument inside, her heart tightened with anxiety. After a while, she saw Shin Manting running out in a panic. It didn't look right. Manting? However, Shin Manting didn't stop and quickly rushed out of the door. Mrs. Shun was slightly shocked. When she was about to enter the door, the baby suddenly cried as if he had a premonition. She opened the door and walked in while coaxing the baby. At a glance, she saw that Shin Luoan's face was dark to the extreme. What's wrong? Mrs. Shin walked in and was a little worried. Did you quarrel with Manting? Shin Luo, and saw his mother and sighed heavily. He sat on the bed and held his head in his hands, feeling hopeless and helpless. He sighed, Mom, what do I have to do to make her stay? Mrs. Shin sighed softly when she heard this. The baby in his arms cried uneasily. Shin Luo, who was lying on the bed, became more and more agitated. He reached out for the baby and said, Give it to me. Madam Shin refused to give it to him. She turned around and said, The child is crying because of you. Please don't hit the child. When did I ever hit a child? Shin Luo, was even more agitated. My temper isn't that bad, is it? Mrs. Shin laughed when she heard this. Look at your temper. Who in the family can have a worse temper than you? Grandma has quite a temper. Grandma is used to being free and unfettered all her life. Of course she has a temper. Manting's temper is worse. That's because you forced me to do it. Do you think I don't know about your bad temper and unforgiving mouth? Mrs. Shin held the infant in her arms and looked at him with a reproachful expression. Didn't you just ask me what I can do to make her stay? She couldn't leave, so she naturally stayed. Shin Luo, wasn't he just spouting nonsense? Chapter 2032. Just this question alone was enough to put him in a difficult position. Shin Luo, scratched his head in frustration before standing up and asking, Where did she go? Mrs. Shin glanced at him and snorted. He ran out a long time ago. Do you think you can find him now? Upon hearing this, Shin Luo, immediately picked up his cell phone and dialed Shin Manting's number. Soon, Shin Manting's cell phone rang from inside the room. The ringtone was pleasing to the ear, but it made Shin Luo, even more agitated. Shin Luo, tossed his phone aside and stormed out in a huff. When he opened the door, it was pitch black outside. Only the street lights were dimly lit. It was already late at night. Shen Manting was still wearing simple and comfortable home clothes. She didn't bring her cell phone, let alone money or identification card. It was already so late and she had nothing on her. Where could she go? Shen Luo furrowed his brows and rushed out, shouting, "Shen Manting!" At this time she shouldn't have gone far. Shen Luo heard the sound of insects in the yard. He ran out, looked around and finally ran to the left. But after running back and forth for a long time, he still couldn't find her. Shen Luo felt a little defeated. He stopped and stood by the side of the road, panting. His mind spun quickly as he carefully recalled the places she might have been to, or the routes she might have taken when she was in a bad mood. After thinking for a long time, Shen Luo located 3 locations. First, a bar. However, she didn't have any money right now, so it was impossible for her to go to such a place to have fun. The second was to go to a friend's house. She did not have many friends. One of them was her former classmate, and the other was a famous socialite in the capital. It was impossible for her to be a socialite. It was very likely that she would go to her classmate's house. However, she didn't even have a phone on her, so she could only put this possibility aside for now. The last possibility was, she was still nearby. She hadn't gone far. Shen Manting was a fake artistic youth. When she was in a bad mood she would probably play on the swing. Shen Luo was confused by his sudden thought. Inexplicably, he thought of the swing in the park, the place where children often climbed up and down. Not to mention adults, even children wouldn't have enough to play with. For some reason Shen Luo walked in the direction of the park. Under the dim streetlights, the swing in the park was empty. There was no one there at all. Shen Luo suddenly felt that he was a little funny, but at the same time he was greatly disappointed. Just as he was about to turn around and leave, he suddenly caught a glimpse of a shadow on the basketball court in the distance. Xiao Xiao shrank under the backboard, her back to the lights, casting a long shadow. Shen Luo was slightly short-sighted, so he didn't see who it was. However, he still subconsciously lightened his footsteps and walked over. Shen Manting leaned against the pillar under the backboard. The cold touch made her feel even more at a loss. Inexplicably he felt a little sad. Tears streamed down her cheeks uncontrollably, and she felt extremely aggrieved. He buried his face between his legs and whimpered softly. However, he suddenly heard faint footsteps behind him. She looked back and saw that it was Shen Luo. Shen Manting was startled. She immediately got up and bounced back subconsciously. Seeing this, Shen Luo stopped and said, "Let's talk." The conflict in her heart grew deeper and deeper. Chapter 2033. Shen Luo felt a pang in his heart when he saw Shen Manting retreating. Just like before, she seemed to be afraid of him. "If you don't want to sign it, then don't sign it. Let's go back and have a good talk." Shen Luo looked at her and spoke very slowly. It was as if he was careful with every word he said. Shen Manting stared at him from afar and didn't say anything. Shen Luo felt even more hurt. He looked at her from afar and said softly, "I know that sometimes my mouth is a little bad, but actually, you're still very good looking." Shen Luo felt a little ashamed to say this. A feeling he had never felt before surrounded him. He quietly took a step closer and said, "It's true. Both your face and your figure are better than before. The reason why I said that was because I didn't want you to be compared to those people." Shen Manting was moved by his words, but the tears in her eyes couldn't help but flow down. How could she not know? This guy had always been like this. But she couldn't stand it anymore. It was not only because of his unparalleled bad mouth, but also because of the indelible things he had done to her. "Manting, go back first. Mom is taking care of the baby now. Mom has to go back to the hospital tomorrow. Think about it, if she's not in a good mood during the operation, how guilty would it be?" Shen Luo slowly approached her. "Shen Luo." Shen Manting looked at him with a pair of clear eyes with a pair of desolate light. "Do you know that I've always hated you?" Shen Luo was stunned and didn't say anything. "I used to think that you were a big brother that I could rely on, a big tree that could shelter me from the wind and rain," Shen Manting said in a choked voice. "But I never thought that I would have a relationship with you. I thought that I would be able to endure it, but who knew that you would become even worse?" Shen Luo was slightly shocked and looked at her in disbelief. "When you said that you would marry me to Oming, I was so happy. I thought, I can finally leave you, I don't have to be this incestuous person anymore. God knows how scared I was when I faced my parents and grandma every day, when they treated me like a daughter or a granddaughter. I'm afraid that they'll call me a slut. They brought me back and treated me like their daughter and descendant, but I've become a slut who seduced the man they're so proud of. Do you know how it feels? I live in guilt every day. At that time Yu was still at home. I called her sister-in-law over and over again, but did she know that her husband was in my bed every night? Shin Manting was on the verge of a breakdown. She clutched her chest and said, I've had enough. I've finally escaped. I thought that by giving birth to the baby, I could threaten you and force you to give me a sum of money so that I could run away. As she spoke, she swallowed a mouthful of saliva and stared at him fixedly. But I can't do it. I can't bear to part with the baby. I can't bear to use him as a bargaining chip for my freedom. But I'm not willing to be imprisoned by you and raped by you. Raping her, such a blatant word was exposed right in front of his eyes. For a moment Shin Luo and couldn't accept it. Shin Manting's voice trembled as she sobbed. Her thin body was like a piece of cardboard and she was on the verge of collapsing. Chapter 2034. In your eyes, I'm nothing more than a sex slave. Shin Manting looked at him with tears streaming down her face. You've always loved Yu, but you hated Yu for so many years because of Guan Kui. I feel so sad for you. Shin Luo and clenched his fists and glared at Shin Manting. He gritted his teeth and said, Shin Manting. Shin Manting chuckled and reached out to wipe her tears. What? You want to hit me? Shin Luo and walked quickly towards her. Her expression changed and she immediately said, Shin Luo, and what do you want? However, Shin Luo and remained silent. Shin Manting's heart was filled with panic. What did he want to do? Her body reacted faster than her anger. She turned around and ran. The park was huge and Shin Manting stumbled as she walked. Stop. He didn't expect her to have such a big reaction. I won't hit you. Stop. But Shin Manting wouldn't stop. Her footsteps quickened, and her body leaned forward slightly as she ran. Shin Luo and was very distressed. Shin Manting ran very fast. His figure was light and agile, and he disappeared into the bushes in a few steps. Shin Luo and felt a headache coming on and shouted, Wait a minute. I'll agree to anything you say. Manting, I never thought that you would have such thoughts. Wait a minute. Shin Manting could clearly hear the voice behind her, and her heart trembled slightly. But his footsteps did not stop. Soon he was out of the road. After running for some time, she suddenly heard Shin Luo An's voice shouting, Get out of the way. Pa, the sound of a long car horn. Shin Manting paused and turned to look at him. The glaring light immediately burned her eyes to the point of pain. He subconsciously narrowed his eyes. When the sports car crashed into her, Shin Manting had a thought in her mind. It's time to put an end to this. Shin Luo and clearly saw the car crash. His pupils shrank and he shouted, Shin Manting. A voice that was on the verge of collapse came from not far away. Shin Manting heard a crisp sound coming from her body. In an instant, a tearing pain spread throughout her entire body. So painful, was he finally going to die? Mrs. Shin finally managed to coax the baby to sleep. Just as she walked out of the door, she suddenly heard the baby crying loudly. This kind of crying came too suddenly, and Shin Foreign was caught off guard and jumped in fright. She hurriedly went forward and picked up the baby. Her heart ached for him as she gently coaxed him. However, the baby's cry this time was different. His little face was flushed red, and his little fists were waving in the air. No matter how she coaxed, hugged, or fed him, he couldn't stop. Mrs. Shin was so anxious that she was about to cry. This was the first time she had sat on the sofa with a baby in her arms, feeling lost. Why aren't they back yet? Mrs. Shin stomped her feet in anger. She picked up her phone and dialed Shin Luo An's number. It rang for a long time but no one picked up. Finally, when it was about to automatically hang up, someone picked up. Hello? Luo An. Mom? Shin Luo An's voice trembled, and it was obvious that he was choking. Mrs. Shin tensed up. What's wrong? However, before Shin Luo An could say anything, he heard a trembling wail. Mrs. Shin was frightened and immediately panicked. She shouted, What's wrong? What's wrong? Chapter 2035. What's wrong? Mrs. Shin had a bad feeling about this. She had watched Shin Luo An grow up, but she had never seen him like this. You have to tell me what's wrong, Mrs. Shin said sternly. Otherwise, I'll track your cell phone signal to find you. It's nothing. Don't ask. Rest early. Shin Luo An hung up the phone. The more Mrs. Shin thought about it, the more she felt that something was wrong. But the baby cried harder and harder and Mrs. Shin was confused. She quickly picked him up and comforted him slowly. but the feeling of being kept in the dark was very uncomfortable. Shin Manting was seriously injured. Her left arm was fractured in 3 places, and her right leg was severely abraded. Her cheeks were also blood-stained and the deep and shallow marks were shocking. The most serious injury was on her head. Her head was severely injured and there was bleeding in many places. Her life was in danger. Shin Luo and almost couldn't stand when he heard the diagnosis. His hands trembled as he looked at the surgical consent letter. After signing it, he couldn't help but sit on the chair in front of the emergency room. He grabbed his hair with his blood-stained hands and cried in despair and grief. I'm sorry. A man in his 30s or 40s stood beside him and sobbed regretfully. I'm sorry, Luo. I drank a little and I thought there would be no one around. Shin Luo and had already lost his strength, but at this moment, he suddenly stood up when he heard this. He stared at him with bloodshot eyes and punched him hard in the face. Zhou Xinghui was in pain and took a step back. Luo and Shin Luo and strode forward and kicked him hard on the body. Zhou Xinghui was kicked to the ground. Before he could react, Shin Luo and had already straddled him, and his fists were like hail, falling heavily. Why did you drink? Why did you drive? Why didn't you look at the road? Zhou Xinghui didn't fight back, nor did he resist. After a while, his face was covered in blood. There were many people in the corridor of the emergency room, and the passing nurses exclaimed, "That's enough. Someone pull them away." Why, Zhou Xinghui? What do I owe you? You hurt my woman like this. It was as if Shin Luo and had completely lost his mind. He attacked mercilessly. When he was pulled away, Zhou Xinghui had already fainted. The blood on his face was mixed with tears and his face was filled with guilt. Shin Longyue was suddenly informed by the hospital staff that Shin Manting was in trouble. He rushed to the hospital in a hurry. However, she did not expect to receive news that Shin Luo and had seriously injured someone and rendered them unconscious. She rushed to the emergency room and saw Shin Luo, and sitting at the door from afar. His face was expressionless as he sat at the door as if he had lost his soul. His home clothes were stained with blood and he was wearing slippers. Shin Longyue's heart sank. Luo en? Shin Luo and tilted his head slightly. His gray eyes were deathly still. When he saw his father, his eyes trembled and he called out, "Dad. What's wrong with Manting?" When Shin Luo and was asked this question, he suddenly felt as if his sore spot had been poked. He couldn't help but feel guilty and remorseful and his eyes reddened. Shin Luo and had always been calm. Ever since he became sensible, she had never seen him like this. Chapter 2036. Shin Longyue's heart sank when the nurse told him about Shin Manting's condition. The nurse saw his gloomy expression and asked curiously, "Director, is the person inside your room?" Shin Longyue glanced at her and sighed softly. "My daughter-in-law." The nurse's eyes were full of sympathy and distress when she heard this. She saw the man with tears on his face at the door. There was no doubt that he was the son of the director. She comforted him and left quickly. Shin Longyue sat down beside Shin Luo, and silently sat with him. The father and son sat at the door for 10 hours. Shin Longyue and Shin Luo, and kept their eyes open and staring at the door of the operating room. They didn't even yawn or take a nap. Finally, the door of the operating room opened. The chief surgeon opened the door and was stunned when he saw Shin Longyue. "Director?" Shin Luo, and immediately got up and grabbed the chief surgeon's clothes. "How is the person inside?" Shin Longyue also came over and said, "This is my son, and the woman inside is my daughter-in-law. How is she now?" The chief surgeon was silent for a moment and seemed to be thinking. Then he said, "She's not in good condition. Although she has received a blood transfusion, her injuries are too serious. Her limbs are broken, and she has lost blood in many parts of her brain. The patient has been in a coma for a long time. It's hard to say whether she will wake up or not." Shin Luo, An's face instantly turned pale. He clutched his surgical gown tightly and shouted angrily, "What do you mean?" "Luo." Shin Longyue pulled him back. "Listen to him first. Little Qin, has she passed the critical period?" Dr. Qin shook his head and said, "Not for the time being. I've given her medicine, and there may be complications within 24 hours. She has to stay in the ICU for observation. If she can survive these 24 hours, she may survive." Shin Luo, and was even more furious when he heard this. He roared, "What do you mean by she may survive?" Dr. Qin looked at him and sighed softly. "Her injuries are too serious. If her vital signs can be stabilized, then she may not die." These vague and heartless words were so cruel that Shin Luo and trembled. She glared at him with bloodshot eyes and said, "If she stabilizes, can she wake up?" Dr. Qin was silent for a moment and looked at Shen Longyue. "Director, you know." Shen Longyue's eyes were already red. He supported Shen Luo and said in a choked voice, "Luo, and go and rest first." Tell me. Shen Luo and could no longer stand. He was half collapsed and half standing. His voice was almost pleading. Stubble had appeared on his originally clean and refined face. His eyes were bloodshot and filled with blood and tears, making him look particularly miserable and ferocious. Dr. Qin couldn't bear it, but he looked at Shen Longyue and said, "Even if he survives, there's a high possibility that he'll become a vegetable." Shen Luo and felt as though he had been struck by lightning. His body stiffened and his mind went blank. There was a high possibility that he would end up in a vegetative state. Shen Luo and collapsed in despair and cried out, "It's impossible. It's impossible." Shen Longyue was heartbroken and desperate. He pulled Shen Luo and then cried in a low voice, "Shen Luo, and stand up." Chapter 2037. Shen Longyue felt a dull pain in his heart. He had high hopes for his son since he was a child. Shen Luo and was also very promising. No matter what he did it well. Shen Luo and never understood what he was thinking about when it came to love. When Guan Kui committed suicide because of him, he didn't shed a single tear. Now, Shen Manting was in trouble and he was in this state. Shen Longyue suddenly hated Shen Manting. He hated her for not living up to his expectations. He hated her for getting hurt so badly. Looking at his son, Shen Longyue closed his eyes. "Go back first. Your son is still waiting for you to come home." Shen Luo and heard that and whispered, "Yes, my son is still waiting for me." She took Shen Longyue's hand and was about to get up. However, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his head. All of a sudden his feet slipped and his whole body fell straight down. Shen Longyue was shocked. "Luo en?" When he checked again, Shen Luo and had already fainted. Shen Luo and was unconscious for a day and a night. The Shen family was in a mess. Shen Jilia and Yi Chanshan had just finished their wedding in Yun Town when they heard the bad news. When the couple hurried back to their home in the capital, they heard the cries of the baby. Mrs. Shen looked haggard. When she saw her son and daughter-in-law return, she couldn't help but cry. "You're finally back." Yi Chanshan's tears fell. She rushed forward and called out, "Mom?" Shen Jilia saw her and didn't say a word. He reached out and took the baby. The baby had obviously cried for a long time. His voice was hoarse and his face was pink. Coming. Nanny, he quickly came out with a bottle in her hand. When she saw Shen Jilia, she handed it to him. "Feed the baby first." Mrs. Shen sat on the sofa and wailed. She hugged Yi Chanshan and couldn't stop. Yi Chanshan's heart felt like it was being corroded by thousands of ants. She gently patted her back and whispered, "Don't cry. Don't cry, Mom." Although that was what she said, she cried even harder. Shen Jilia didn't say a word. He carried the baby back to his room. His heart was heavy. He called Shen Longyue and the call was quickly picked up. However, his voice sounded very tired. "Jilia." "Dad." Shen Jilia's expression was solemn. "Is brother awake?" "Not yet." "Where's Sister Manting?" Shen Longyue did not reply. He sighed and said, "Take good care of your mother and the baby. I'll inform you when Manting wakes up. I'll leave the baby with Chanshan. I'll go to the hospital later." "All right." Shen Longyue was exhausted. Not only was he physically tired, but he was also mentally tired. He had never been so tired before. After feeding the baby and coaxing him to sleep, Shen Jilia went to Shen Luo An's room. After settling him down, he gave Yi Chanshan some instructions before driving to the hospital. When she stepped into the ward, Shen Luo An happened to wake up. The first thing he asked when he woke up was, "How's Manting?" "Brother, father," Shen Jilia said as he walked in. "Sister Manting is fine. She has passed the critical stage and is still under observation." When Shen Luo An heard this, he immediately lifted the blanket and got out of bed. "I'll go take a look." As soon as he got off the bed, he staggered. Shen Jilia quickly held him up and said, "Be careful." Shen Luo An's vision was a little blurry. It took him a while to stand up straight. Chapter 2038. Shen Luo An's physical fitness wasn't particularly strong. He had endured for a long time yesterday and the day before, so he couldn't take it anymore. Shen Jilia held him and sighed softly. "Brother, you have to take care of yourself so that you can take care of Manting." Shen Luo and opened his eyes and composed himself. I'll go and take a look. Shin Manting was in the ICU while Shin Luo and looked in through the glass. His heart ached when he saw her hands and feet tied up. Her head was completely wrapped with only a white bandage that was slightly bleeding. She looked particularly pathetic. His heart felt as if it had been fiercely stabbed, and the pain was almost suffocating. When he came back to his senses, he found that tears had rolled down his face. Shin Luo's body twitched and he couldn't bear it anymore. He squatted down and cried bitterly. Shin Jilya had lived to his late 20s and had grown up with Shin Luo. He had never seen him like this before. He squatted down silently and stood side by side with him. Shin Jilya gently patted his shoulder and didn't make a sound. Shin Manting slept for half a month. The doctor finally confirmed that she had become a vegetable. The atmosphere in the Shin family was oppressive. 2 years wasn't long, but it wasn't short either. Since Shin Manting was lying in the hospital, Shin Luo had devoted himself to the studio. He spent the rest of his time in the studio, except for the 2 hours he spent by Shin Manting's bed with the child. Daddy. The child stumbled into Shin Luo's arms, holding a cute fluffy toy in his hands. Daddy, this is a gift from Grandma. Shin Luo stood up with his son in his arms and said, Little bunny, you're so cute. Little Moon grinned and said, Daddy, come see Mommy. Shin Luo's eyes softened and he said, Okay, Daddy will take you to see Mommy. Little Moon was very obedient. He had just celebrated his 2nd birthday and was very intelligent. His facial features looked more and more like Shin Luo, and as if they were carved from the same mold. Shin Luo drove him to the hospital. It was very quiet. It was a particularly warm winter. The hospital was a little quieter than usual after the new year. He led the little boy to Shin Manting's ward with ease. He lowered his head and said, What did Daddy teach you? What do you have to do first when you enter the ward? Knock on the door. Little Moon held the bunny in his arms, clenched his fists and knocked on the door twice. He even said, Knock knock. Shin Luo smirked. Then he pushed the door open and shouted along with Little Moon, Mom, Little Moon is here to see you. The father and son walked in, but when Shin Luo saw the hospital bed, he suddenly felt as if all the blood in his body had flowed backward to his brain. Suddenly his mind went blank. The sickbed was empty. Suddenly Shin Luo roared, Where is he? Xiao Yu was startled by her loud voice. Little Moon's mouth twitched and he took a step back and burst into tears. Shin Luo also realized that he was overreacting. He quickly picked up the child and went outside. He roared, Where is she? Who is looking after this ward? Where is Shin Manting? His voice was extremely loud. His voice echoed in the corridor. Soon a nurse ran over and poked her head in to take a look. There was no one in the ward. Her heart skipped a beat and she asked, Where is he? Chapter 2039. The nurse shuddered and immediately said, I'll go look for her right away. After saying that, she ran away as if she was escaping. Little Moon had stopped crying. He hugged Shin Luo's neck and asked, Daddy, where's Mommy? Shin Luo couldn't help panicking. His heart was beating extremely fast, and an unbearable despair was currently pressing down on his chest, causing him to almost be unable to breathe. Daddy, don't cry. Little Moon's soft little palm brushed across Shin Luo's eyes. Shin Luo took a deep breath and coaxed him softly, Little Moon's a good boy. Daddy will take you to Grandpa first. It wasn't far from the hospital director's office. Shin Longyue was shocked to see Shin Luo's reddened eyes. What's wrong? Shin Luo tried to calm himself down and said, Daddy, look after the child. Manting is missing. Shin Longyue was shocked. What? Why would she disappear out of nowhere? Shin Luo also had the same question welling up in his heart. However, no one could answer him. Now we can only check the surveillance footage to see when Manting left. Daddy, I'll leave this matter to you. I'll go look for her. Even the nurse didn't find her, so she can't have gone far. Shin Longyue knew the gravity of the matter and nodded. Okay. After receiving his confirmation, Shin Luo immediately put the child down and ran away. Little Moon was puzzled. He tilted his head and asked, Grandpa, where did Daddy go? Shin Longyue picked up the child and said, Daddy went to look for Mommy. Then he made a phone call and went to the surveillance room. Shin Luo ran hurriedly to the ward and corridor next to him. At the same time, there were many doctors and nurses looking for him. A vegetable had disappeared without anyone noticing. This matter was simply absurd to the extreme. Many people hurried around to look for him. Soon everyone knew what had happened. After checking the surveillance footage, there was no one like Shin Manting who had left. Shin Luo and went from the first floor to the 7th floor but found nothing. Shin Luo and leaned against the wall helplessly. He felt a cold touch on his back. Suddenly someone shouted, "Found her!" Shin Luo and immediately became alert and ran in the direction of the voice. "Oh, found who?" "The vegetative patient in room 139 has been found." Shin Luo and immediately rushed forward and saw a group of people blocking the door of a ward from afar. Excuse me, excuse me, excuse me." Shin Luo and pushed his way through the crowd. As soon as he entered, he heard a child crying. The child opened his mouth and cried, holding half a bun in his hand. After glancing at Shin Luo, he turned to look at the corner. In the corner, there was a woman with disheveled hair. His face was pale and his body was thin and weak. She was dressed in a loose hospital gown and was hugging her legs nervously. She raised her eyes and looked at Shin Luo. That gaze. Clean and pure like an innocent child. However, Shin Luo recognized Shin Manting at a glance. After lying in bed for 2 years, Shin Manting was as thin as a stick. But that charm, even if she were dead, he would still recognize it. Unknowingly, droplets of water were already dripping from his eyes. Shin Luo walked over and called out softly, "Manting?" Chapter 2040. His voice was trembling with obvious fear. Shin Luo was stunned. He suddenly squatted down and reached out to hold her arm. "What did you say?" Shin Manting's body trembled violently, and tears streamed down her face. She trembled in fear and shouted, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Uncle, let me go. I won't do it again." His voice was filled with regret and unspeakable fear. Shin Luo felt as if his heart had been bitten by thousands of ants. He stared at her in disbelief, his heart aching. Shin Manting begged and was about to kneel down. "Enough." Shin Luo bellowed angrily. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her firmly in his arms. Shin Manting was stunned, and her body trembled uncontrollably. Enough, enough." Shin Luo's voice was choked with sobs, filled with endless despair. He buried his face in her neck and said in a trembling voice, "It's really enough." "Manting, I'm sorry." Shin Manting was stunned and didn't know what to do for a moment. She could clearly feel the warmth of the man in front of her, and the fear and nervousness in her heart immediately dissipated. For some reason he felt a slight pain in his heart. However, he was still rational. She gently pushed him and shouted, "Uncle?" Shin Luo let go of her and looked at the blank expression on her face. He got up and said, "Get up. I'll take you home." Go home?" A look of fear flashed across Shin Manting's face. She pushed him away and shouted, "Uncle, don't call me uncle." Shin Luo's voice was a bit loud. But when he turned around, he saw that Shin Manting was obviously frightened. His heart ached and his voice softened. "Follow me back to the ward first. Let the doctor examine you." Shin Manting looked around. All the medical equipment was clearly displayed, and many people were wearing hospital gowns. There was also the smell of medicine and disinfectant in the air. Shin Manting suddenly panicked and burst into tears again. "Am I sick again? Is Uncle Dean angry?" Shin Luo held her hand and slowly stood up. But when she heard this, she couldn't help but burst into tears. He covered his face with one hand and remained silent. Soon he pushed his way through the crowd and walked out. Shin Manting remained quiet throughout, sobbing as she followed behind Shin Luo. "Don't cry." Then he pulled her into his arms with one hand and said, "Be quiet for the examination first. Answer whatever the doctor asks you later. Do you understand?" Shin Manting nodded blankly. She sniffled hard and said, "Got it." Shin Luo picked up his phone and called Shin Jilya. "Found it?" As soon as he hung up the phone, he heard an old man's voice. Shin Manting looked over and saw a gentle and kind-looking man walking over. He was carrying a child who looked to be in his 50s or 60s. When Shin Longyue saw Shin Manting, he was shocked. Then he swallowed hard and said, Good, you're finally awake." It was Shin Yuexiao's first time seeing Shin Manting with her eyes open. He was a little curious, so he struggled to get off the bed and asked, "Mom?" Shin Manting heard his voice and looked around. Then she looked at Shin Luo in astonishment and said, "You are a woman? But. Chapter 2041. As soon as she finished speaking, the 3 people in the room all looked at her. a look of sorrow, a look of curiosity, a look of doubt. Shen Longyue frowned when he heard this. Luo, and what's going on? Shen Luo, and looked at his father and shook his head blankly. She doesn't seem to recognize me. Soon a doctor rushed over. When he saw Shen Longyue, he was stunned and called out, Director. Director. Shen Longyue nodded and said, give her a checkup. Yes. The medical staff quickly arrived. Please take them out. Following his instructions, they quickly left the room. After a series of examinations, the doctors came out. However, when they came out, the doctors had a strange look on their faces. She seems to have forgotten who she is. What's going on? Shinjilia hurried down. He was still wearing a white coat and was panting slightly. Is Sister Manting awake? Yes. Shen Luo, and closed his eyes. That's great. It's good that she's awake. Everything else can be solved. Shinjilia breathed a sigh of relief. Her brain was severely damaged. It's normal for her to have memory problems. I'll go in and take a look. The doctor also recognized Shinjilia, so he nodded and didn't stop him. When Shinjilia went in, he saw Shen Manting trying to sneak through the window. She had already lifted one foot, but she seemed to have no strength. It was very difficult. Shinjilia was shocked and shouted, What are you doing? Shen Manting trembled violently and turned her head to look. When she saw Shinjilia running over, she immediately hugged the window railing and shouted, No, don't pull me. I don't have money to pay for the medical fees. Just let me jump off the building and die. Shinjilia was stunned. Without another word, he pulled her down from the chair. Shen Manting's body was as light as a swallow. He could directly pull her up with one hand. Shen Manting's face was sad and she struggled with her hands and feet. When she found that she couldn't move, she actually hugged Shinjilia's thigh. Shinjilia was shocked. Before he could react, he heard a loud roar coming from below. Sob, 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 Uncle, I don't have money. Don't check me anymore. I'm an orphan. I don't have money. The orphanage is going to collapse. If Uncle Director knows that I've been checked so many times in the hospital, he'll definitely kill me. Please don't check me anymore. Shinjilia didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard that. When she turned around, Shen Luo and Shen Longyue had already walked in. Shen Luo An's face darkened when he saw what she was doing. He quickly stepped forward and pulled her away. But Shen Manting seemed to be possessed. She clung to Shinjilia's thigh tightly and cried out, Uncle, don't pull me. I don't have money to pay for the medical fees. Even if you pull me, I'll pay you back when I grow up. Don't go looking for Uncle Director. He'll kill me. When Shen Luo heard this, his arms trembled even more. He gritted his teeth and shouted, Shen Manting, stand up or else I'll make you pay the medical fees yourself. Shen Manting suddenly stopped crying and looked at Shen Luo. She sobbed and said, Are you talking to me? Is there anyone else called Shen Manting here besides you? Shen Manting immediately stood up, but her body was weak and she almost fell down again. Shen Luo reacted quickly and held her in his arms. Shen Manting was 168 centimeters and Shen Luo was 180 centimeters. When she stood up, her forehead was just close to his chin. Chapter 2042. As soon as she said that, Shinjilia burst into laughter. Shen Luo An's face darkened. He wrapped his arms around her waist, lifted her up and put her on the hospital bed. He looked at Shen Manting for a while and couldn't help but say, Because I'm your man. Shen Manting looked at him with her eyes wide open. What? Shinjilia quickly pulled Shen Luo and said, Brother, don't scare her. Leave it to me. You can go out first. No. Shen Luo took a stool and sat down. You do what you need to do. I'll sit here. How can we do that? Shinjilia frowned, but when he saw the unhappy look on his father's face, he couldn't help but cough softly and curl his lips. In that case, Dad, please take care of Little Moon for a while. Shen Longyue knew the gravity of the situation. He nodded and said, Little Moon, let's go. Shen Yueshao didn't comply. He looked at Shen Manting with his big black eyes and said, Mom. Shen Manting finally saw it clearly. She was shocked and exclaimed, No way. Is she calling me mommy? When did I have such a big son? Shen Longyue's heart ached when he heard this. He glanced at Shen Manting and sighed. Let's go, Little Moon. Come back to see Mom later. Okay. Shen Yueshao was reluctant to leave. Mom, Little Moon will come back to see you tomorrow. Shen Manting heard a childish voice. Shen Manting listened to it and found it familiar. She seemed to hear this sentence every day. She felt a dull pain in her heart. Suddenly she felt as if she had seen a ghost. She looked at the two men in front of her and sat quietly. Shen Luo, and picked up his recording pen and turned it on. He said, "From now on I'll ask you a question and you'll answer it. Tell me everything you know and the truth. Do you understand?" "Okay." Shen Manting looked at Shen Luo and then at Shen Jielia. She said, "Uncle, will your brother really pay for my medical expenses?" When Shen Jielia heard this, he chuckled. "How did you know he was my brother? You called him brother just now and you called the grandfather just now dad. Also, you look a little similar, which means that you are biological brothers, the sons of the grandfather just now." She then rubbed her stomach and said, "I'm so hungry. I'm so hungry that I don't have any strength left in me." Shinjilia felt relieved. At the very least his IQ wasn't low. Shinjilia took a few notes in his notebook and said, "I'll get you something to eat later. Answer the question first. How old are you?" 12 years old. A 12-year-old calls me uncle. Do I look that old? Shen Luo, and asked suddenly. Shinjilia almost burst out laughing. It seemed that Shen Luo and was very bothered by the way she addressed him as uncle. However, he immediately coughed lightly and said, "Brother, please keep quiet." Shen Luo and immediately fell silent. Shen Manting said, "You look like you're in your 30s. Although you're not particularly old, you're much older than me." Yes, this was the 12-year-old Shin Manting. Shinjilia made a few notes in the notebook and asked, "Do you remember what you were doing before you passed out?" "Of course I remember." Shin Manting looked a little sad and said without hesitation, "The director asked me to help him buy soy sauce and go back to cook. But when I went back, I tripped and the soy sauce bottle broke. I was beaten by the director's aunt. When I woke up, I was in the hospital." Shinjilia frowned and looked up. He asked, "Do you remember what your name is?" "Yunsuan." "How do you write it?" Chapter 2043. Shinjilia and Shen Luo, and both looked at her. Shen Manting shrank back under their stares and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong? Have you always been called this name?" Shinjilia asked. As he spoke, he looked at Shen Manting's expression and added, "Tell me the truth." Shen Manting frowned when she heard this and said, "This is my name, not Shen Manting. When I was young, I was abandoned on the street. They didn't even give me a birthday card. Later, an old man who picked up garbage sent me to an orphanage." Shen Luo, and was silent. Shinjilia nodded and asked, "And then?" "Then the old man said that since he didn't raise me, why did he give birth to me? So, the director gave me this name. He Yunsuan. She gave a child such a name. Why did she allow it to exist?" Shen Luo, and felt a little pain in his heart. He realized that he knew nothing about her. "Do you know Zhang Meifang?" Shinjilia recorded in his notebook and looked up at Shin Manting. "Yes," Shin Manting nodded. "She's my good friend, but the director likes her very much. She's beautiful and sensible." Shinjilia and Shin Luo and looked at each other. They both saw a trace of doubt in each other's eyes. "What's wrong?" Shin Manting looked at them and suddenly looked a little sad. She asked in a low voice, "Did you find the wrong person? Is the person you're looking for actually Meifang?" "No, we're looking for you." Shinjilia tapped the back of his hand with the pen and said slowly, "Have you seen me?" "No." "Have you seen him?" "No." "What do you usually like to eat?" Shin Manting exclaimed. When she heard this, she covered her growling stomach and said, "I'm actually not picky. I eat anything." Shin Luo, and suddenly asked, "Do you eat onions?" "No." Shin Manting's face immediately fell. "No." "Do you eat coriander?" "No," Shin Luo, and smiled lightly. "Then why did you say you eat anything?" Shin Manting was speechless. He asked a few more questions. Shin Manting did not hesitate and readily followed his advice. But when she asked about Shin Manting, there was an obvious look of doubt on her face. "Who is Shin Yueshao? Who is Shin Luo and who is Shinjilia?" "I don't know anyone." "All right," Shinjilia said as he put the notebook away. "I have a general understanding of the situation. Now I have something to tell you. Don't be too shocked." "What?" Shin Manting looked at him curiously with an innocent look on her face. She was completely different from the usual Shin Manting. Shinjilia paused for a moment, then stood up and said, "Give me a moment." After walking out for a few minutes, he came back with a mirror in his hand. He handed it to Shin Manting and said, "Take a look at yourself." When Shin Manting saw this, she was baffled. He took it and looked at it. He turned pale with fright. Shin Manting flung the mirror away and asked in horror, "Who is this?" This kind of reaction was a little too big. Shen Luo and didn't expect this and couldn't sit still. He picked up the mirror and said, "This is Shen Manting. She's my sister-in-law and the mother of my nephew. She's 31 years old and lives in the capital. She's been an orphan since she was young." Chapter 2044. However, as soon as Shen Manting finished speaking, she found that the eyes of the two men in front of her remained unchanged. Shen Manting was shocked and suddenly felt a little like crying. She pursed her lips and burst into tears. "You're lying to me. I haven't aged. This isn't me at all. I'm only 12 years old." Shen Julia glanced at Shen Luo and then sighed softly. "Brother, we can't go on like this." Shen Luo and also had a headache and said, "You go ahead. Leave it to me. I'm afraid that you can't handle it." She seems to have lost her memory from the age of 12 to 29. It's a whole 17 years. "You?" Shen Manting had a bad feeling and looked at them. "Didn't you say that I was 31 years old?" "Yes." Shen Julia looked at her with a little sympathy in his eyes. "You had a car accident when you were 29. Your hands and feet were broken and your head was severely injured. You've been lying in bed for 2 years. What? What? Shen Manting couldn't believe it. "You mean I've been in the hospital for 2 years? How much money is that?" Shen Julia was speechless. She turned around and patted Shen Luo and on the shoulder. "Communicate well and guide her. I'll go ahead." "Okay." Shen Luo and responded. His eyes calmly fell on Shen Manting. He slowly said, "You're the mother of my child. It's my duty to take care of you." "What?" Shen Manting felt dizzy. "I haven't grown up and I'm not married. How could I have a child?" "Unfortunately you did." Shen Luo and walked over and poured her a glass of water. "What do you want for dinner?" Shen Manting immediately straightened up. "So, you're my husband. I want to have a big meal. Is that okay?" "Husband?" Shen Luo and was caught off guard. The word suddenly rippled in his heart. He looked at her with his amber eyes and said slowly, "Yes." Shen Manting suddenly became excited and said, "Then, husband, I want to have a big meal. The kind that needs to be cut with a knife and fork." Her eyes were dark and bright, pure and clean with expectation and desire. Shen Luo An's heart ached. He handed the water to her and said, "Drink some water first." Shen Manting took the water from him and gulped it down. "Are we going to have a feast?" she asked. "Not yet." Shen Manting was disappointed. "What? It's all a lie. You made me call you hubby. Give it back to me." He explained, "You've just woken up so your body can't handle it yet. When you're better, I'll take you to whatever you want to eat." "Really?" Shen Manting looked at him expectantly. "You promised?" "Yes, I will." Shen Luo and nodded. "I'll ask my family to prepare a nutritious meal for you." "Sure." Shen Manting's eyes sparkled. He was secretly delighted. It seemed like it was pretty good. This uncle looked quite handsome, nice, and had a good personality. The most important thing was that she didn't have to be scolded by Uncle Dean, and she didn't have to deal with the people in the orphanage. She rolled her eyes and looked at Shen Luo Han. Then, "Hubby, can I ask you a question?" Hubby, it was another word that caught him off guard. Shen Luo and straightened up and answered in a low voice, "Yes. We've already given birth to a child. Have we kissed?" Shen Luo and looked at her again, perhaps because such a question was too childish. Chapter 2045. Shen Luo and glanced at her a few more times because her question was too childish. Shen Manting shrank back and whispered, "I swore that my first kiss would be reserved for my Prince Charming." Her silly and cute words made the soft part of Shen Luo and restless for a moment. He moved an inch and leaned toward her. Shen Manting subconsciously shrank back, but in the next moment Shen Luo and had already reached out and clamped her chin, accurately capturing her lips. The soft and smooth touch was immediately transmitted from his lips. Shen Manting's eyes widened, but soon she closed them again. Shen Luo and had never felt like this before. It turned out that Shen Manting would be so obedient when he kissed her. He couldn't help but ask for more. He gently pried open her lips and teeth, captured her softness and slowly invaded. After an unknown period of time, Shen Manting couldn't stand it anymore. She gently pushed him away and Shen Luo and released her. Shen Manting immediately panted, and her cheeks were a little red. She looked at him shyly. Shen Luo and was even more confused. He couldn't help but move closer and look at her deeply. Shin Manting shrank back, then lay on the bed and covered her head with the quilt. Her voice came from under the quilt and it was a little muffled. Honey, I don't want to have children anymore. After she had a big meal, she would consider whether to continue kissing her biological child. However, she was so hungry now. Kissing shouldn't make her pregnant, right? Shin Manting was a little uncertain. She lifted the quilt and revealed one eye. At a glance, she saw Shin Luo, and standing. Shin Luo, and looked at her with a deep gaze. He was a little sad and glad. Shin Manting suddenly felt that he was very pitiful. She whispered, Honey, are you very sad? When Shin Luo and heard this, he suddenly smiled and said, No. Then why do you look so sad? Shin Manting looked at him with a little guilt and apology. She whispered, But I still want to say don't kiss me in the future. What if I get pregnant? I don't want to have children. I heard that giving birth is very painful. Very painful. Can even kill people. Shin Manting thought of this and shrank back. When Shin Luo and heard this, he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Who told you that kissing will make you pregnant? Ah, Shin Manting's face was burning with embarrassment. She covered her face with the blanket in embarrassment and whispered, That's what everyone says, Shin Luo, and let out a rare laugh. He moved closer and whispered, I won't, but I'm your Prince Charming. Our child is already 2 years old. You have to call me hubby from now on. Do you understand? Perhaps it was because Shin Luo and was so close to her that she felt her heart warm up. Her face was also hot. She nodded and said, Yes, I know, hubby. Shin Luoan's heart softened and tears welled up in his eyes. He turned around and said, I'll make the call. Shin Manting looked at his back and suddenly felt a little sad. This feeling came out of nowhere. It was a little scary, but at the same time, there was satisfaction and excitement. This feeling seemed to be instinctive. Even she herself did not know what she was sad about, excited about, or satisfied about. He stayed in the hospital for 3 days. After 3 days, when the doctors confirmed that she was physically and mentally fit to be discharged, Shin Manting returned to the so-called home. It was a beautiful and luxurious house. She had never seen such a big and beautiful house. Mom. Chapter 2046. Shin Manting was a little frightened. It wasn't that she hadn't seen this child in the past few days, but it was still very difficult for her to accept that such a large meatball had actually popped out from her stomach. She looked at him and squatted down. Shin Yueshao also looked at her. The mother and son looked at each other for a long time. The little fellow stretched out his arms and shouted, Mommy, hug me. Shin Manting's heart suddenly softened. Her lips unconsciously curled into a smile and she reached out to hug him. Manting is back. Nanny's eyes were slightly red. I'm glad you're back. I'm glad you're back. Shin Manting blinked her eyes in confusion. Shin Luo and reminded her, This is Nanny He. Hello, Nanny He. Shin Manting greeted her obediently and quickly followed Shin Luo and into the room with the infant in her arms. This is our room. Shin Luo and stood up straight and pointed to a small bed inside. The baby sleeps there. Shin Manting nodded. Are we going to sleep here? As he spoke, he walked over and looked at the big bed. But when she turned around, she saw Shin Luo and slightly strange expression. Shin Manting thought she had said something wrong. She hugged the baby and shrank her head. She whispered, Aren't Daddy and Mommy supposed to sleep together? She didn't have parents, but the parents of other children slept in the same room on the same bed. Shin Luo's eyes softened. He nodded slightly. Yes. Shin Manting breathed a sigh of relief. She sat down with the baby in her arms and said, What a big bed. I've never slept in such a big bed before. Wow, it's so bouncy and comfortable. Manting, you're back? An old man's voice rang out. Shin Manting felt a sense of familiarity when she heard it. She put the baby down, stood up and walked out. When she saw the old woman walking toward her, she greeted, Grandma. Old Mrs. Shin immediately rushed forward and hugged Shin Manting with reddened eyes. It's good that you're back. It's good that you're back. You're finally out of the hospital. Let Luo and take you out for a walk. Yeah. Shin Manting smiled slyly and said, Hubby said he's taking me out for a feast today. Hubby? Nanny, he couldn't help turning around to take a second look at the way she addressed him. The others had already seen how thorough Shin Manting's amnesia was, so they were not surprised by it. Old Mrs. Shin nodded and said, All right, go ahead then. Luo, and take good care of Manting. Okay. Shin Luo and chuckled. I won't be bringing little Moon along. Just watch. Okay. Old Mrs. Shin's eyes curved into crescents as she smiled. Manting was finally as obedient as she was now. Of course, he had to create more opportunities for them to be alone together. He took Shin Manting for a stroll around the neighborhood of the house. Everything he saw was new and interesting. She didn't reject Shin Luo, and holding her hand. His palm was soft and warm. She was just too skinny. Let's go. Okay. Shin Manting agreed happily and got into his car. Hubby, will it be just the two of us? Yes. Shin Luo, and glanced at her, his eyes full of tenderness. This is called a world of the two of us. Shin Manting blushed when she heard that. She asked in a low voice, are we going on a date? Shin Luo, and chuckled. He leaned over and said, yes, come closer. Chapter 2047. Shin Luoan's heart warmed when he saw her pouting little mouth in front of him. He lowered his head slightly and gently kissed her lips. He gently held her in his arms and felt her obviously too thin body. His heart ached a little. He reached out and pulled the seat belt behind her. He let go of her and said, I'll take you to eat your favorite food. Shin Manting's cheeks were red and she was very happy. She nodded and looked at Shin Luo and with a pair of shining eyes. She said sincerely, honey, you're so nice. Honey, you're so nice. It was impossible for Shin Manting to utter those words, but she could hear them clearly from the side. Shin Luo, Anne's hands trembled slightly when he buckled her seat belt. If she knew how much she used to hate him, would she still say such words? Would she still say good things about him? Would she still call him husband? There was no doubt about the answer. But soon it returned to normal. Let's go. Okay. The car drove steadily to the Western restaurant that Shin Manting used to like to go to in the past. He ordered her favorite dishes. Shin Manting looked around curiously as if she had never seen it before. She leaned forward and whispered, honey, is our family very rich? Shin Luo, and chuckled. Why do you ask? One look and you can tell that this is a very expensive place. I just looked at the menu and it costs more than $500 for a steak. It's so expensive. When I was obedient, Uncle Dean only gave me 10 cents to buy candy. Shin Manting felt a little wronged as she spoke. But soon she covered her mouth and said timidly, honey, am I too childish? Shin Luo, and felt a slight pain in his heart and looked at her sadly. He shook his head against his will and said, no, it's very good. Shin Manting vaguely felt that he was lying. But she didn't expose him. Nodding his head, he quietly sat up straight and still. Soon the dishes were served. There was only one steak on a very fragrant and high-end plate. Shin Manting opened her eyes wide but didn't say anything. After the waiter left, she said, honey, it's even more beautiful than what I saw on TV. Shin Luo, and chuckled and picked up the knife and fork. Come on, I'll teach you how to cut it. Yes. Shin Manting beamed. She looked at Shin Luo, Anne's expression and demonstrated it to him, and he quickly followed her advice. Just like she knew how to use it. After a hearty meal, Shin Luo and Shin Manting went shopping. He bought a lot of clothes. Shin Manting was too thin now. After choosing 2 sets of clothes, she tugged at Shin Luo and then said, honey, I've just woken up. The smallest one is already too big for me. Don't buy it now. I'll buy it again when I gain some weight. Shin Luo, and nodded with a smile. Returning home was a rewarding journey. Shin Yueshao had already fallen asleep. Shin Luo and Shin Manting crept into the room quietly. Go take a shower first. I'll get you your pajamas, Shin Luo, and said. Okay. Shin Manting didn't dare to speak too loudly and quickly walked into the bathroom. However, he was dazzled by the spacious bathroom and exclaimed, it's too big. Shin Luo, and was holding her pajamas. When he heard this, he smiled and asked, do you know how to shower? Shin Manting looked at him as if he was retarded. Do you think I'm stupid? She took the pajamas and pushed him out. Don't peek at me. The smile on Shin Luo, Anne's face widened. He nodded with a smile and said, I'll wait for you. Shin Manting's face turned red. Chapter 2048. Her heart was beating fast. Shin Manting was in a good mood. She hummed a tune, took off her clothes and entered the shower room. She turned on the water and tested the temperature before she suddenly realized that something was wrong. When she was in the orphanage, she used to boil water for bathing. Why did she know how to use such an advanced thing here? Shin Manting suddenly felt a little excited and muttered, it seems that I'm really a genius. While she was happily bathing, she touched her small chest. The bulge seemed so big. She couldn't hold it with one hand. She was so thin, how did it grow? After bathing awkwardly, she found that her body was different everywhere. After a while, Shin Manting put on clean pajamas and walked out. Her wet hair was wrapped up. Shin Luo and didn't know what he was doing. When he saw her come out, he seemed to hide something under the quilt. Shin Manting blushed and shouted, "Honey, what are you doing?" "Nothing." Shin Luo and stood up. "Dry your hair. Don't catch a cold." "I won't." Shin Manting waved her arm. "There's a heater in the room. It's not cold. Sit down." "Okay." Shin Manting sat on the bed and couldn't help but look under the quilt curiously. Shin Luo and noticed her little movement, but he pretended not to see it. He removed the towel from her head and slowly dried her hair. The heater in the room was on, and soon her hair was half dry. Shin Luo and quickly went to take a shower, and Shin Manting immediately reached out to the quilt. She felt a small box. The box was made of black velvet and felt smooth and comfortable. She opened the box and inside was a ring. It was a big shiny diamond in the shape of a heart. Shin Manting's eyes lit up. She couldn't help but pick it up and put it on her finger. Almost automatically, she put it on the ring finger of her left hand. There was no flesh on her finger, so it was easy to put on. It was very loose and dangled on her finger. But for some reason, she suddenly felt an unknown place in her heart began to ache. She suddenly felt a little sad. She stared at the ring and her eyes were a little hot. An urge to cry was difficult to suppress. It came crazily but inexplicably. He quietly put the ring back and continued to stuff it under the blanket, pretending that he had not touched it at all. But when she fell onto the bed, she couldn't help but burst into tears. She whimpered softly, her heart was empty, very empty. When Shin Luo and came out, Shin Manting was already asleep on the bed. The position was in the middle. The lights were still on, very bright. However, she was sleeping soundly. Her even breathing could be heard, almost in sync with her son's. He walked up quietly and subconsciously touched the ring he had just placed on the table. It's still there. He was a little disappointed, but he quickly placed the ring in the drawer of the bedside table. He turned off the lights and lay down. There was a faint sense of satisfaction and joy in his heart. He reached out and gently pulled her into his embrace. Shin Manting was asleep. When she sensed his breath, she couldn't help but lean forward and reach out to grab his clothes. "Honey, I feel so sad." Shin Luo An's body stiffened. He placed his hand on her cheek and asked softly, "What's wrong?" Chapter 2049. Shin Luo An's body stiffened when he heard this. His heart ached and he looked down at her face. The room was dark, but he could still clearly feel the tears on Shin Manting's face. She was different from before. She was different at all. In the past, Shin Manting would cry with a smile. It was ugly and cruel. But now she was crying. She was just crying. She was different. She was different. Shin Luo An silently pulled her into his arms and hugged her tightly. Shin Manting subconsciously leaned over and wrapped her arms around him. She rubbed against his chest. His body smelled faintly of shampoo. It was warm. Shin Luo An gently patted her back and whispered, "Don't think about anything. Go to sleep." "Okay." Shin Manting closed her eyes and soon fell into a deep sleep. Shin Luo An hugged her and his heart ached. He closed his eyes, but his mind was in a mess and he couldn't sleep. Early morning. Shin Manting's body ached from sleeping and she stretched. But when she turned around, she saw Shin Luo An looking at her. His amber eyes were clear and quiet. Shin Manting was startled and her body twitched. Then she shrank back and her cheeks were a little hot. "Good morning, honey." Shin Luo An smiled and said, "Good morning." Shin Manting immediately got up and went to the bathroom. She closed the door and was in a good mood. After washing up, she walked out and saw Shin Luo undressing the child. Shin Yueshao saw Shin Manting coming out and called out with a smile, "Mom." Shin Manting walked over and touched the little boy's head. "Good boy." The little boy was a little happy. He opened his arms and rubbed them in Shin Manting's direction. "Give me a hug." Shin Manting squatted down and picked up the little boy. "Let's go. Mom will take you to dinner." "Okay." Shin Yueshao was very happy and hugged Shin Manting's neck. Shin Luo An smiled with relief when he saw it, but then he reminded her, "You haven't brushed your teeth yet. Help little Moon brush his teeth first." Shin Manting was shocked. "He's so young and he's already brushing his teeth? Of course you have to brush your teeth. It won't hurt so much when you're changing your teeth." Shin Luo An tapped her nose. You have to instill good education and habits in your child. Oh. Shin Manting held the baby in her arms. Let's go then. Does he know how to do it? Yes. Little Moon had already spoken up. Mommy, I can brush my teeth. Shin Manting couldn't help but exclaim, he's indeed a doctor's child. She carried him into the bathroom and said, let's go. From today onwards she would learn to be a good mother. Be a good mother. No matter what, she must have given birth to this child. Otherwise, how could he look so much like her? Moreover, he was adorable no matter how she looked at him. She could get a son without having to suffer any pain. It was worth it. But just as this thought flashed through his mind, he heard the child's voice. Be. Shin Manting froze and looked at him. Little Moon pouted and said, Mommy pee. She looked at Shin Luo and said, Dear, the baby wants to pee. Shin Luo and chuckled when he saw her pleading look. He took the baby from her arms and said, Go and have breakfast first. I'll clean up for your baby. Okay, Shin Manting replied and turned around. She felt sweet inside and said, I'll wait for you. Chapter 2050. When Shin Manting walked out, the whole family was already outside. A young woman was sitting next to Shinjilia. She looked very lively and beautiful. When she saw Shin Manting, her eyes lit up and she exclaimed, Manting. Shin Manting was a little flattered. She stepped back and said, I'm Yi Chanshan Chanshan? Yi Chanshan pointed to herself and then to Shinjilia. Shinjilia's wife. As she spoke, she hugged Shin Manting excitedly. You're finally awake. That's great. Yi Chanshan's eyes were a little red. She patted her back and said in a choked voice, Everything will be fine. Shin Manting suddenly didn't know how to react. She laughed and said, Sisi, I'm hungry. Oh. Yi Chanshan immediately released her and smiled happily. Well, let's eat together. Yi Chanshan held Shin Manting's hand and walked to the table. Shin Manting looked around and called out, Dad, Mom, Grandma. The people who were called all smiled. Mrs. Shin smiled and said, Don't be so formal at home. Well, eat more. Look at how thin you are. Old Mrs. Shin's heart ached for her. She handed her a bowl and asked, When will your body be as fair and plump as it used to be? Shin Manting glanced at her body. Fair and plump? She had never experienced what it felt like to be fair and plump. So, she had been fair and plump before? Shin Manting sat down and nodded. She was a little touched. When they were halfway through eating, Shin Luo and came out with his son. Little Moon was bouncing up and down. When he saw Shin Manting, he called out, Mom. Shin Manting's eyes softened and she nodded. Shin Luo and carried him to the dining table and sat down. He said, Who else hasn't been called? Grandpa, Grandma. After greeting Grandpa and Grandma in a childish voice, his eyes fell on old Mrs. Shin. He blinked and called out, Grandma. Shin Luo and chuckled and pinched his little face. He corrected, Great-Grandma. Take Grandma. He shouted loudly, but it wasn't accurate. Everyone laughed. Old Mrs. Shin smiled and gave him a cup of soy milk. Say it again. Take Grandma. Yi Chanshan couldn't stop laughing and asked, What about me? What about me? Little Moon tilted his head and thought for a moment, but he still didn't know what to say. He looked at Shin Luo and for help. Daddy, Shin Luo, and chuckled and greeted, Aunt. Little Moon called out softly, Sensen. Auntie, Yi Chanshan corrected her. Lift your tongue, Auntie. Little Moon looked a little helpless as if he knew that he had called out the wrong name. He shrunk his head and whispered, Sensen. Yi Chanshan gave up and gave him a small bun. Be good. Xiao Yu took it from her and beamed with joy. Shin Luo and bowed his head and said, Thank you, Aunt. Xie Sensen. The whole family couldn't help but laugh. Shinjilia finally walked over and chuckled helplessly. Calling Mom and Dad is quite smooth, but calling anyone else is no good. Uncle. Little Moon looked at Shinjilia excitedly and called out to him. Shinjilia laughed and said, You're smart. Little Moon knew that he had been praised and swung his legs happily. Our Little Moon can talk about other things, Shin Luo, and sat beside him and said, What do you want to say to Mommy? Little Moon smiled and pointed at Shin Luo. Then he shouted, Mommy, Little Moon is here to see you. Chapter 2051. It was a very familiar sentence. It was as if she had heard it countless times when she was asleep. After the young child finished speaking, he laughed happily. He took a bite of the little bun in his hand and smiled happily. She felt a lump in her throat and had the urge to cry. Shen Luo, and seemed to notice Shen Manting's gaze and looked at her. His eyes were a little soft and he looked at her with a smile on his face. After breakfast, Shen Luo and handed the baby to Yi Qianqian. After getting her full assurance, he led Shen Manting out. Shen Manting sat in the driver's seat. This time she had learned to be smart. She buckled her seat belt and looked at Shen Luo Han. Honey, where are we going today? To the orphanage. Shen Luo and glanced at her. Back to the orphanage. Shen Manting opened her eyes wide and said, Are we going to the orphanage? Yes. Shen Manting was a little scared after getting a positive answer. She slid her hand on the seat belt and asked, Why are we going back? To find your good friend. Shen Luo and looked at her. Do you remember what you told me your name? Shen Manting felt a little strange when she heard this. After thinking for a while, she said, He Yun Suan. Was that your name when you were in the orphanage? Shen Manting nodded and looked at the expression on Shen Luo An's face. She felt a little scared and asked, What's wrong? What about Zhang Meifang? She is my good friend. Shen Manting was very sure. Honey, you have asked this question twice. The last time was in the ward a few days ago. He and Shinjilia were asking this question. When it came to this question, both of their expressions didn't look too good. They were indescribably solemn. Could it be that there was a problem? Shen Manting looked at him but Shen Luo and didn't say anything. He said, Sit tight. Okay. Shen Manting was already seated. I'm ready. Shen Luo and glanced at her, started the car and sped away. By the time they arrived at the orphanage, almost an hour had passed. During this hour, Shen Manting looked out of the window and played with her phone from time to time. He stopped the car and turned off the GPS. We're here, he said. Shen Manting looked up and exclaimed, Hubby, why has this place become so run down? It's been 19 years. Of course it will change. Shen Luo and unbuckled his seatbelt. Let's go. When Shen Manting got out of the car, the sun was blazing. He narrowed his eyes and looked at the two children sitting at the door. The two children looked to be only 5 or 6 years old. When they saw Shen Luo An's car, their eyes lit up in surprise. Shen Manting felt a little sour in her heart. Finally, I'm not the one looking at other people's cars. Now these children are also looking at my car. She caught up with him, held his arm and asked, Hubby, is the director still around? Shen Luo and asked. Is the director still around? Yes. Shen Luo and glanced at her. Do you remember which room it was? Shen Manting nodded and pulled Shen Luo and into the yard. The children were running around and playing games. Seeing these two strangers dressed so well, they couldn't help but take a few more glances. Director. Shen Manting shouted. Is the director around? Chapter 2052. Are you the dean? Shen Manting looked at the man in front of her, who was about the same age as Shen Luo, and was surprised. The man looked at her and said, The dean is resting at the moment. Why are you looking for him? Shen Manting breathed a sigh of relief and said, I used to live here and now I'm back to look for him. Oh. The man looked at Shen Manting and said, Who are you? Why do you look so familiar? However, he was too thin. He looked so thin that he was out of shape. She couldn't recognize him at all. When Shen Manting heard this, she smiled and said, Do you know me? I'm He Yun Suan. The man looked at her in surprise and said, Yun Suan? Really? Why are you? Why is he so thin? Yes. Shen Manting looked as usual, then glanced at Shen Luo and took his arm and said, This is my husband, Shen Luo Han. He's a scientist. The man was even more surprised. A scientist? No, Shen Luo and pressed Shen Manting's hand. I'm just researching some medicine. Is the old dean here? Oh, he's sleeping. The old man hasn't been in good health recently. The man kept glancing at Shen Manting as he spoke and said, Yun Suan has become so big. Time flies. Do you still remember who I am? Oh. Shen Manting looked at him with her eyes wide open and frowned. She vaguely felt that he was a little familiar, but the difference from when he was a child was too big. Shen Manting couldn't recognize who he was at all. The man laughed and said, Don't you remember me? I'm He Junxing. He Junxing? Shen Manting covered her mouth. No way, how is it possible? He Junxing touched his head with a little embarrassment. Yes, I've changed a little. Come on in and sit down. Shen Manting's face was still full of disbelief when she led the two in. Isn't He Junxing the silly little brother from before? You look so smart now. Shen Manting's memory stopped at the age of 12, so she didn't have many words in her mind. What he said at this moment was the truth of the heavens. He Junxing felt even more embarrassed and said, yes? Shen Luo An's lips curved into a smile. He pressed Shen Manting down and said, she got into a car accident 2 years ago and was hospitalized for 2 years. She has some memory problems and can only remember things from before she was 12 years old. He Junxing was stunned for a moment, then he looked at Shen Manting with understanding in his eyes. He looked at her sympathetically and said, Yunsuan is a very smart person. The headmaster likes him very much. I'll go see if the headmaster has woken up. Wait a minute, Shen Luo An stopped him. Since you grew up with her, you should know a lot about her. Let's talk first. He Junxing looked at Shen Manting and nodded. Have a seat. I'll make you some tea. Shen Luo An was indeed a little thirsty, so he didn't refuse. Shen Manting made herself at home and pulled Shen Luo An to sit on the bone stool. The decoration of the house was very old, and the furniture seemed to be from more than 10 years ago. Shen Manting looked around and suddenly stood up. She said, Hubby Meifang and I drew a butterfly here. Come and take a look. Shen Luo An stood up and walked over. Sure enough, he saw the shallow marks. There were 2 butterflies, one crooked and the other dancing. There was a signature at the bottom, and it was written Zhang Meifang at the bottom. On the butterfly that looked slightly better, it was written He Yunsuan. There was also a smiling face at the bottom. The marks were very shallow, and it was obvious that a long time had passed. The orphanage was not big and the decoration was very old. Shen Luo An looked around and saw that He Junxing had already brought the tea set. Shen Luo An pulled Shen Manting back to sit down. He Junxing smiled and said, It's been a long time since we had a guest. The tea set was left for a while and it was just washed. After boiling the water, He Junxing looked at Shen Manting and said, She just woke up, didn't she? She's too thin. Yes, she woke up a few days ago. Shen Luo An looked at him. But are you sure she's He Yunsuan? Yes, He Junxing looked at her. She's witty and clever. She's obviously powerful. Who else could it be if not Yunsuan? Then, what about Zhang Meifang? Shen Luo An asked. At the mention of this name, He Junxing was quite emotional. Meifang is quiet and seems to be quiet. She's not very smart. Compared to Yunsuan, she's far behind. Where is she? She disappeared when she was a teenager. I don't know where she went. At that time, I called the police and looked for the surveillance cameras, but they couldn't find her anywhere. He Junxing disinfected the tea set when the water was boiling. It's a pity. Meifang is kind and good-looking. Back then, my grandmother came to adopt her. Shen Luo An looked at him. At that time, she found someone based on her horoscope, and the person she adopted was Zhang Meifang. He Junxing's teacup trembled and the cup fell. The boiling water splashed and sprayed Shen Manting's fingers. Shen Manting shrank her hand in pain and hurriedly covered it. Shen Luo An was shocked. He pulled her hand over and quickly checked it. Are you okay? I'm fine. Shen Manting was a little embarrassed. She pushed his hand away and looked at He Junxing. Junxing, can't you find Meifang now? He Junxing suddenly looked a little flustered and said, Who's here? A slightly old voice was heard. An old man who looked to be in his 50s or 60s walked over. Shen Manting recognized him at a glance. Uncle Dean. She stood up and walked over to him to help him. When Uncle Dean saw Shen Manting, he was stunned. You are Yunsuan? Shen Manting said her name without any hesitation. The moment she said it, the look on the dean's face changed a little. He subconsciously glanced at Shen Luo An and asked, Who is this? My husband. Shen Manting smiled and helped the old man to sit down beside the chair. Long time no see. Yes, long time no see. The dean smiled, but he looked a little uncomfortable. I haven't been here for a long time. You're here for, Dean, I want to know where Zhang Meifang is. The dean's expression changed. Zhang Meifang? He Junxing looked at him and frowned. Dean, it's okay. Meifang was adopted. The dean felt a little guilty. She hasn't been back for many years. Didn't she get lost? Shen Luo An asked. Mr. He just said that Zhang Meifang got lost when she was a teenager. Moreover, you said that she was adopted. When she became an adult, she was adopted by our family again. What's going on? The person they wanted to adopt was Zhang Meifang. Chapter 2053. The person they wanted to adopt was Zhang Meifang. In the end, they adopted He Yunsuan instead. Grandma would never lie to her family, so there was only one explanation: Grandma had been deceived. According to He Junxing, Zhang Meifang had long been lost. In the end, when Grandma went to look for her, the orphanage replaced Zhang Meifang with He Yunxuan. Why did they do that? The director was sweating profusely when he heard this. He panicked and said, My name is Shenluo An. Shenluo, and took out his business card. The director held the white business card in his hand and couldn't help but feel nervous. My grandmother adopted a girl named Zhang Meifang from this orphanage. As Shenluo An spoke, he paid close attention to the director's expression. My grandmother firmly believed that she was my missing sister, who had been missing for more than 10 years. When she came to look for her, she brought along her birth date. Later, when she did a paternity test, she discovered that she had nothing to do with our family. The director looked up at him and said, Maybe it was a mistake. Yes, we thought so too, Shenluo An said slowly. But this time, Manting got into a car accident and was bedridden for 2 years. When she woke up, she only remembered things before she was 12 years old and believed that her name was He Yunxuan. Then what about Zhang Meifang? The more the director listened, the more nervous he became. He Junxing looked at the director and sighed softly. Uncle Director, I just told him that Meifang went missing when she was 14 years old. The director looked at He Junxing in disbelief. You? He Junxing lowered his head guiltily. I forgot about that for a moment. I'm sorry. Sigh. The director put down the business card and looked sad. Mr. Shin, I'm sorry. What do you mean? When she was ready to adopt Meifang, she had already gone missing. At that time, she used Meifang's date of birth to look for her. The director looked sad. At that time, the orphanage was poor. She said that if she could find her granddaughter, she would give us 100,000 yuan as a token of appreciation. So you lied to my grandmother? Shenluo An frowned slightly. Does the date of birth that my grandmother provided match Meifang's? The president nodded. That's right. At that time, I was muddle-headed. I wanted the $100,000 and I wanted Yun Xiyuan to live a good life. So I asked Yun Xiyuan to pretend to be Meifang and go to your house. As he spoke, he looked at Shin Manting. Shin Manting's eyes were already brimming with tears. What about Meifang? I don't know. The director shook his head. She was a young girl at that time. It's normal for her to be kidnapped and sold. After returning from the orphanage, Shin Manting was in low spirits. On his way here he looked left and right. But when Shin Manting returned, she was speechless. She looked at Shenluo An and asked, Honey, is it possible that Meifang is your biological sister? Shenluo An glanced at Shin Manting and nodded. Yes. Does that mean I can't be called Shin Manting anymore? Shin Manting looked at Shenluo An and said, The real Shin Manting is Meifang and I'm a fake. It's just like what they say on TV. We were replaced by a leopard cat. I'm the leopard cat and Meifang is the crown prince. Chapter 2054. I'm not Shin Manting either. Shin Manting was a little disappointed. I'm used to it. You all call me Manting, but Manting is gone. Can I still be Manting? Shenluo An sighed softly and glanced at her sideways. He held the steering wheel with one hand and held her hand with the other. Looking at the road ahead, he said slowly, What are you talking about? No matter who you used to be or who the real Shin Manting is, you are you now. You are Shin Manting. I'm just here to take a look because I'm a genius. Honey, will you still be my husband in the future? Shin Manting looked at him with a pair of big eyes full of doubt and expectation. Shenluo An's heart fluttered when he suddenly heard this. He turned his head and looked into her dark and clear eyes. He felt a little choked. After a long time he said softly, As long as you want, we will always be husband and wife. Shin Manting's originally gloomy mood suddenly became joyful. With a smile on her face, she lowered her head and played with the hem of her dress. She said happily, Of course I want to. We will always be husband and wife. Shenluo An looked at her deeply and looked away. There was a dull pain in his chest and his hands trembled slightly. Looking at the bright sky ahead, he said tentatively and pleadingly, Then let's go to the Civil Affairs Bureau tomorrow. Shin Manting didn't hear clearly. Honey, what did you say? Looking at her clear and innocent eyes, Shenluo An's courage suddenly shrank. His throat was a little dry and he said, Nothing. It was already afternoon when they returned to the city. Shin Manting was hungry, so he took her out for dinner. It was already 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon when they returned home. Because Shin Manting woke up, Shenluo An hadn't been to the laboratory for several days. Old Fifth made one call after another. In the end, Shen Luo and couldn't win against Lao Wu. He had to leave Shen Manting at home and go out. Before going out, Shen Manting seemed to be a little flustered and called out, "Honey." Shen Luo and turned around. "What's wrong? When will you be back?" "At night." Shen Luo and rubbed her little head and said softly, "I'll try to come back as soon as possible." "Oh." Shen Manting looked a little disappointed. "Can't you bring me along?" "Be good and stay at home. It'll be fine." Shen Luo and looked a little helpless. "You can spend some time with your son. You're his mother. You need to nurture your relationship with him." "All right." Shen Manting finally felt a little relieved. She tugged at his clothes reluctantly and said, "Then, come back soon." "Okay." Shen Luo and let go of her hand and turned around. But before he could take 2 steps, he heard another shout from behind, "Hubby!" He turned around and saw Shen Manting running towards him with a flushed face. Shen Manting stood on her tiptoes and kissed him on the lips. "I'll wait for you to come back," she said. Shen Luo An's heart was itching. He couldn't help it. He held her head with one hand and kissed her on the lips. His nimble and powerful tongue probed into her mouth and gently pried open her pearly white teeth. It pierced in slightly, tyrannically and greedily, rolling her out, holding her tightly to him. His kiss was a little forceful. Shen Manting had never experienced such a feeling before. For a moment she didn't know what to do. Chapter 2055. Shen Manting's heartbeat quickened, and she instinctively wrapped her arms around his waist. Shen Luo and couldn't help but push her against the door. Cough, cough. The woman's coughing successfully pulled him back to reality. When he released her, he noticed that her face was completely red. Wiping the water from the corner of his mouth, he lowered his head slightly. Shen Luo An's Adam's apple tightened when he saw her expression. Damn it. His body, which had been empty for 3 years, began to heat up uncontrollably. He looked behind Shen Manting and immediately saw Yi Qianqian. Yi Qianqian looked at him suggestively and said, "Big brother, isn't it a little inconvenient to do this at the doorstep? Why don't we return to our room?" Shen Manting's face turned even redder. She turned around and glared at Yi Qianqian shyly. She stomped her feet and said, "You're so mean." Her coquettish voice carried the annoyance and coquettishness of a young girl. Shen Luo An's heart melted as he listened. Yi Qianqian was stunned and subconsciously looked at Shen Manting's back. Then he couldn't help but sigh. It was indeed the consciousness of a little girl. Shen Luo and couldn't help but say, "Don't tease her. She's still young." Yi Qianqian replied, "Big brother, it really isn't appropriate to do it at the door." Shen Luo and was speechless. He turned around and said, "I'm going to work. Be careful on the road, big brother." Yi Qianqian waved at him. She closed the door and skipped toward her room. Shen Jiliya was taking an afternoon nap. When he sensed Yi Qianqian enter, he didn't move. He looked up and breathed steadily. Yi Qianqian took off her shoes, lifted the covers and crawled into bed. She reached over and hugged Shen Jiliya's waist. She straddled his lap and called out, "Old Shen, get up." Shen Jiliya didn't open his eyes. He flipped over in her position and hugged her face to face. Yi Qianqian felt a little defeated and continued, "Is it fun to dream?" Shen Jiliya was speechless. "More fun than me?" Shen Jiliya opened his eyes and asked, "Do you miss me?" Yi Qianqian's lips curled up, but before she could finish, Shen Jiliya pounced on her like a wolf. Yi Qianqian screamed with laughter and shouted, "Wait! I have something to say." Shen Jiliya pinned her under his body and held her firmly between his legs as he said, "I'm going to play with you now." "Wait a minute, I'm just kidding," Yi Qianqian exclaimed. Shen Jiliya kissed her on the mouth and murmured, "It's too late." Oh. Yi Qianqian's words were completely swallowed by him. When she was feeling dizzy from the kiss, she pushed his face away and said, "Guess what I just saw?" "What?" Shen Jiliya was tugging at her clothes, trying his best to pull them off and throw them away. However, after a few tugs, Yi Qianqian refused to cooperate. She frowned and shouted, "Get up for a second." Yi Qianqian arched her back, and Shen Jiliya finally managed to pull the sweater off. "I saw Big Brother kissing Manting." Yi Qianqian wrapped her arms around his neck. "But Manting is obviously still a child. Doesn't Big Brother feel like he's molesting a child?" Shen Jiliya's originally serious face couldn't help but burst out laughing. He lifted the blanket up and hugged her exposed head. He pressed his lips against her neck and whispered, What are you thinking about? Sister Manting is 2 years older than me. Oh, you didn't see it? She just... Oh. Yi Qianshan's words were cut off. Chapter 2056. At first, Yi Qianshan still had the strength to deal with his fierce attacks, but then she completely fell under his passion. Slow down. Shinjilia worked very hard and didn't stop for a moment. When it was almost over, he whispered into her ear, "I want a child." Yi Qianshan narrowed her eyes and hugged him. Her eyes were wet and she whispered, "This is not a reason for you to indulge." Get? Shinjilia laughed out loud and kissed her more passionately. Shen Manting originally wanted to ask Yi Qianshan something, but when she walked to the door she heard faint sounds coming from inside. He didn't deliberately try to cover it up. Even though his voice was pitifully soft through the door, Shen Manting could still hear him clearly as she stood close to the door. For some reason, her hand that was about to knock on the door suddenly stopped. His cheeks began to heat up slightly, and images that made him blush immediately popped up in his mind like a conditioned reflex. She obviously hadn't seen it, but she knew it clearly. Shen Manting withdrew her hand and turned to return to her room. She picked up her phone and after studying it for a while, she finally opened the browser. She saw 2 words, search. She clicked on it, and a keyboard page automatically popped up. She touched it with her finger and poked a few times. She typed, "How to make your husband happy." She clicked on it and the first line was, 10 little things to make your husband happy. After reading back and forth for a long time, Shen Manting blushed and closed the page. Shen Luo, and came back very late that night. It was almost 11 p.m. When he opened the door, the room was dark. There was no doubt that the child had fallen asleep. However, when he walked in and was about to turn on the lights in the room suddenly lit up. Shen Luo, and was startled. When he came back to his senses, he saw Shen Manting in her pajamas standing next to the switch. "Husband, you're back." Shen Manting went up to him. "Let me help you take off your coat." Shen Luo, and was a little flattered and looked at her. Shen Manting had already reached out to touch his coat and smoothly took off his clothes. Then she hung up the coat and said, "Sit down for a while. I'll help you run the bath." Shen Luo, and looked at her strangely and asked, "What's wrong?" When Shen Manting heard this, her cheeks became a little hot and she said, "I just want to help you run the bath." Then he walked in. The sound of running water came from the bathroom and Shen Luo, Anne's heart warmed slightly. Shen Manting walked in and sat beside the bathtub. She stared blankly at the clear hot water flowing down. When he heard the footsteps, he immediately stood up. Shen Luo, and stared at her and walked in leisurely. "What's wrong with you today?" When Shen Manting heard his question, she lowered her head in embarrassment and said, "Nothing, I just want to be a good wife." She looked up at him with her clear eyes and said, "Hubby, from today onwards I'm going to run the bathtub for you every day. I don't know how to make breakfast at work, but I can help you with your tie." As he spoke, the light in his eyes became even more mesmerizing. Shen Luo, and stared at the cute little woman in front of him. His heart couldn't help but flutter. "I still have to learn how to make love lunchboxes." Shen Manting swallowed her words. She was startled by his sudden embrace. What's wrong?" Shen Luo, and hugged her tightly. Shen Manting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she actually felt that he was afraid. But wasn't he a man? What would a man be afraid of? Chapter 2057. Shen Luo, and hugged her tightly. Shen Manting didn't know if it was an illusion, but she felt that he was afraid. But wasn't he a man? What would a man be afraid of? Shen Manting didn't understand. She hugged the man and whispered, "Honey." The room was silent. There was only the sound of the bathtub running water in the bathroom. Shen Luo, and hugged her and whispered, "Manting, I love you." His voice was very low, and there was an almost inaudible quiver in it. Shen Manting was slightly stunned when she heard this. She should be happy. But she didn't know why she felt a little sad. She felt that Shen Luo, and was hugging her tighter. She groaned and whispered, "Honey, you're too tight. I'm uncomfortable." Shen Luo, and released her slightly when he heard this. Shen Manting noticed that Shen Luo, Anne's eyes were a little red. Her heart ached and she felt a little sad. Shen Manting pouted and looked at Shen Luo. "Honey, what's wrong with you today?" "It's nothing." Shen Luo, and combed her hair behind her ear and whispered, "I'm very happy." Shin Manting saw the slight smile on his lips and felt a little better. Well, as long as you're happy. I'll do this for you every day in the future. Shin Manting smiled and put her hands on his shoulders. She stood on tiptoe and kissed him. I love you too. After saying this, she felt a little sweet in her heart. With a smile on his lips, he quickly ran out. She held the door handle and looked at him deeply when she was about to close it. After a moment, she turned around and her heart was beating fast. I'm in love, Shin Manting said to herself. Her face was hot and her mood was high. Shin Luo, and stood in the bathroom for a long time before he turned to look at the bathtub. The water was running fast and it was almost full. I just want to be a good wife. Her simple and shy words made Shin Luo's heart beat faster. How nice. When he came out of the shower, Shin Manting was already asleep. He gently lifted the quilt and got into bed. Shin Luo, and gently wrapped his arm around her waist. Shin Manting sensed his arrival and snuggled into his arms. She breathed heavily in his arms, relying on him and greedily. Shin Luo, and smiled and quickly closed his eyes. The baby woke up early the next morning. A childish voice called out in a childish voice, Daddy. Shin Luo, and woke up immediately. Shin Yueshao was standing on the child's bed, leaning against the railing and looking at him pitifully. Shin Luo, and subconsciously glanced at Shin Manting. She was still asleep, but he didn't know what she was dreaming about. There was a faint smile on her lips. Shin Luo, and stood up quietly, picked up his son and walked inside. After her son was done peeing, she helped the little boy brush his teeth, wash his face and change his clothes. Shin Manting slowly woke up after everything was done. When he stood up, he was shocked to find that the father and son were already neatly dressed. Looking at the time, it was already 7:30. She quickly got up and said, Hubby, I woke up late. Why didn't you wake me up? Nothing much. Go back to sleep if you're tired. Shin Luo, and walked over with the baby in his arms. Call me Mommy. Mommy? The little boy reached out to Shin Manting. Give me a hug. Shin Manting hugged him and said regretfully, I wanted to help you shave and tie your tie, but I can't do that today. Shin Luo's gaze softened. He held her chin and kissed her on the lips. Chapter 2058. Shin Manting's cheeks were pink and she shrank back. When Shin Luo and saw her like this, he couldn't help but lean forward and say, I don't mind. Shin Manting's face turned even redder. I mind. Then she glanced at Shin Luo and the child and said, I'm going to brush my teeth. After getting out of bed, Shin Manting hurried into the bathroom. She touched her face. It was burning hot. My husband is so dirty. I didn't even brush my teeth and he kissed me just like that. Shin Manting looked at herself in the mirror and took a whiff of her breath. Seems okay. After washing up, Shin Manting walked out and saw Shinjilia playing with a tablet with the little boy in his arms. Do you know what this is? Shinjilia whispered and pointed to a watermelon. Tell me. Shin Yueshao looked at it for a long time, then pointed to it and said, Eat? Shinjilia smiled and rubbed his head, saying, You know it's eat. You're smart. What about this? Mom. Xiao Yuer called out. He was very excited to see Shin Manting. He struggled to get down from Shinjilia's lap and shouted, Mommy? Shinjilia put him down and sighed, This little boy doesn't want me now that he has a mother. Little ingrate. Little Moon ran over and hugged Shin Manting with a smile. He jumped up and down and shouted, Mommy. Shin Manting picked up the little boy and was in a good mood. She looked at Shinjilia and asked, Where's my husband? Well, Shinjilia was still very unfamiliar with the way Shin Manting addressed him. He lowered his head and touched his nose, saying, He just went out. You should be in the garden. Okay, thank you. Shin Manting walked out with Little Moon in her arms, looking very motherly. Shinjilia looked at her back and said with a sigh, You've really changed. Right, I wasn't wrong, right? When Yi Qianqian came out, she heard Shinjilia's voice. She reached out and pulled him up to sit down, saying, My father doesn't seem to be in good health recently. I called him, but he was either sleeping or coughing. I asked him what happened, but he didn't tell me. Old Shin, let's go back to Yuntown to see him. Sure. Shinjilia looked at her. I'll drop by Kingstown on the way to see Lily's children. Humph. Yi Qianqian gave him a look of disdain. You never forget to take care of the children wherever you go. Shinjilia stood up and gently nudged her shoulder with his. He winked at her and said, I like it. His feminine voice gave Yi Qianqian goosebumps. He rubbed his arms and hurriedly walked to the dining table. Let's go tomorrow. I'm worried that Dad might get sick. You should ask for leave from the hospital. So urgent. Shinjilia picked up his phone. Alright, let's go. Tomorrow is Saturday. Come back on Wednesday. Yi Chanshan looked at him and smiled brightly. Okay. How could Shinjilia refuse? With a chuckle he replied, all right. When Shen Manting walked out with the baby in her arms, Shen Luo, and was indeed standing in the garden. He seemed to be pulling out weeds for an unknown plant. His movements were slow and elegant, and he looked like he was taking his time. Daddy. Little Moon was already one step ahead of her and shouted. He swung his legs in Shen Manting's arms. The little boy wasn't heavy, but he was still quite strong. Shen Manting couldn't carry him anymore. She loosened her grip and bent down to put him down. Chapter 2059. Shen Manting couldn't help but rub her sore hands. Shen Luo and saw it and stood up, patted the dust off his hands and asked, What's wrong? My hands are sore. Shen Manting rubbed her arms and glanced at Little Moon, who was squatting on the ground to pull weeds. The little guy is quite heavy. Don't hold him for too long in the future. Shen Luo, and patted the dust off his hands, reached out to hold her arm and slowly rubbed it for her. Your hand was injured and it may be very uncomfortable if it bears heavy weights for too long. Oh. Shen Manting bit her lip and chuckled. I know. Let's go and take our son back for breakfast. I want to go for a walk. Shen Manting looked at him. Honey, take me for a walk. I haven't been around here much. In the past few days Shen Luo and had driven her out. However, she had never been out of the neighborhood. Occasionally she felt that the neighborhood was very familiar, but it was indeed very strange. Hearing Shen Manting's request, Shen Luo and glanced at her, and his heart was slightly moved. Take a walk in the neighborhood. If they walked in the neighborhood they would inevitably pass by the small park and the basketball court. Shen Manting's desperate hysteria on that night 2 years ago still seemed to echo in his ears. He would never forget that look for the rest of his life. In the face of her expectant and longing gaze, Shen Luo and was a little afraid to look at it. Soon he looked away. He looked at his son, who was squatting on the ground and playing with weeds, and said slowly, Let's have breakfast first. There's nothing to see around here. Oh. Shen Manting looked a little disappointed. Then let's go in first. Shen Luo and didn't dare to look at her and responded in a low voice. When it was time for breakfast, Shinjilia and Yi Chanshan were almost done. Shinjilia stood up, and before he left, he suddenly remembered something and said, Brother, I'm going back to Yuntown with Chanshan tomorrow. Don't go to the laboratory for the next 2 days. Stay at home with the child and sister-in-law. Sister-in-law. These 2 words came out of Shinjilia's mouth, and it was indescribably pleasing to the ear. She couldn't help but glance at him and say, Got it? You can go. You haven't been taking care of my child for long, so don't take credit here. Hey, Shinjilia wiped the corner of his mouth and said with a look of helplessness and disdain, You're burning the bridge after crossing the river. Before sister-in-law woke up, Chanshan Dad and I took care of him together. You're always running around in the laboratory, and little you, almost doesn't recognize his father anymore. Little Moon raised his head when he heard his name being called. He looked at Shinjilia and then at Shen Luohan. Her little hand was holding a plastic spoon, and she was chewing on the porridge. Shinjilia looked at him and clicked his tongue. Look at your table manners. Look at how you're eating. Little Moon ignored him and lowered his head to continue eating. That's enough. Let's go. Shen Luo and couldn't stand it anymore. You're affecting my son's meal by standing here. Shinjilia replied, You're heartless. He left quickly. When Shinjilia entered the room, Yi Chanshan was packing her clothes. When she saw Shinjilia come in, Yi Chanshan didn't even look up and said, It shouldn't be too cold in Yuntown. Oh, by the way, Tong Tong is getting married next month. She wants us to go together. No, Shinjilia said without hesitation. What does her marriage have to do with me? Chapter 2060. We're friends after all. Why don't we go when we get married? Yi Chanshan glanced at him. You're a man. Why are you so petty? I'm not going. Shinjilia looked as if there was no room for negotiation. But who is she married? Oh, her colleague in the company. He looks quite honest. You've met him? I've seen his picture. Yi Chanshan folded the clothes and put them in her suitcase. I think he's pretty good. Tisk, that's why I say you women only know how to bully honest people. What did honest people do? Yi Qianshan said. Tong Tong is also very honest. Other than her current husband, she hasn't had a boyfriend. Shinjilia didn't say anything and helped her fold the clothes. What time is it? Aren't you going to work? Yi Qianshan glanced at the time. Buddy, it's 8:30. Shinjilia placed the folded clothes on the bed and leaned over. Kiss me. Yi Qianshan replied. No. Kiss me. No. Yi Qianshan turned her head away in disgust and stuffed the folded clothes into her suitcase. Shinjilia leaned forward. Then I'll kiss you. As he said this, he leaned over and pinched her chin. Yi Qianshan's face was straightened and she was kissed. Yi Qianshan's face was squeezed out of shape. She turned her head away, but Shinjilia picked her up and threw her on the bed. Shinjilia pressed his body down and held her hands in place as he kissed her. Let's go. Yi Qianshan was still firmly trapped. After struggling for a while, she simply gave up. When Shinjilia was in the mood for kissing, he opened his mouth and bit her. Shinjilia didn't let go. He pulled away and said, Are you really going to bite me? Yi Qianshan didn't feel guilty when she saw him like this. She shouted, Hurry up and go to work. How dare you bite me? Shinjilia clenched his teeth. With a fierce look on his face, he rubbed his hands together and looked like a hooligan. He touched her waist and shouted, I'm not going to work. Yi Qianshan screamed but with a smile. Go away, you pervert. You're committing adultery in broad daylight. So be it. Shinjilia lifted her clothes. I'm coming. Yi Qianshan hugged his head and laughed. In ancient times, you would be drowned in a pig cage. Shinjilia responded with a groan. He opened his mouth and sucked on her soft snow-white lips. However, just as he was about to eat, he heard a clear knock on the door. Both Shinjilia and Yi Qianshan froze and turned their heads to look. The white door was ajar and the knocking continued. Shinluo, Anne's voice could be heard. Can you close the door a little? There are children inside. Yi Qianshan's face suddenly turned red. He kicked Shinjilia away and said, B****, how dare you not close the door? Shinjilia couldn't remember whether he had closed the door or not. After being kicked, his anger subsided a little. He straightened his clothes and got out of bed. Shinluo, and stood nearby, and Shin Manting's face was already flushed. Shinjilia was a little embarrassed. He coughed lightly and his cheeks were a little hot. He said awkwardly, I was just joking. I'm about to go to work. Shinluo, and glanced at him. You could have left a long time ago. You're a bad influence on children. Chapter 2061. Shinjilia was even more embarrassed. He simply turned around and walked back without explaining. When he saw Yi Qianshan sitting there with a straight face, he coughed softly and said, I told you not to stay at home. It's so embarrassing. Yi Qianshan raised her eyebrows and asked, Who's to blame? Shinjilia said, Me. Shinjilia finally went to work. When he went out, Shinluo, and was not calm. His body, which had not been nourished for a long time, was extremely tense at this moment. In the past 3 years he had also thought about it, but it had never been as turbulent as it was today. He tensed up and looked at Shin Manting. Shin Manting was too thin and looked like she did not have much flesh. And no way. She would hate him. Shinluo, and took a long breath and walked back to the room. Shin Manting blushed a little, but when she saw him walking back to the room, she quickly followed him. Little Moon was squatting on the ground playing with a model plane, unaware of what had happened between the adults. Shin Manting called out, Hubby. Yes. Shinluo, and was very anxious, and when he saw her follow him in, he became even more restless. The anger that he had not felt for a long time surged, and the desire that had been suppressed for a long time was once again easily aroused. However, when he saw her innocent expression, he could only forcibly suppress his anger. He forced himself to calm down and looked at her, asking, What's wrong? I think Jilia and Qianshan are very happy. They look so happy every day. Shin Manting looked at him with a pair of sparkling eyes. She looked at him and said, I think they are like a real husband and wife. When Shinluo, and heard this, he seemed to have read between the lines. He glanced at her and asked, What do you think about us? Shin Manting looked at him and said softly, I don't think we are as husband and wife as they are. I always feel that something is missing. As she spoke, Shin Manting stepped forward and said, That's why I think I want to be a good wife, but I still feel that something is missing. As she spoke, Shin Manting took another step forward. Shin Luo and hurriedly took a step back and looked at her. His body was even more tense. Shin Manting's fair face was flushed as if she had applied rouge. She looked particularly charming. Her appearance was so cute that it made people want to directly crush her. His Adam's apple tightened. He averted his eyes and said, "Don't let your imagination run wild. We're fine." "No, I think there's something missing." Shin Manting was usually quite obedient, but for some reason she seemed very stubborn today. "I think you know what it is, don't you?" Shin Manting took a step closer. "Hubby, you must know why. If Jilia and Chanshan can play like that, why don't you play with me?" Shin Luo and stepped back, not daring to look at her. He walked to the door and said, "We're not children anymore. There's nothing fun here." Jilia and sister-in-law are still children at heart. We've grown up and are adults. We can't be compared to them. Shin Luo and noticed that her eyes had turned red. Shin Manting looked as if something extremely heartbreaking had happened to her, and soon big drops of tears fell from her eyes. "Jilia likes Chanshan, so he plays with her. You don't play with me because you don't like me, right?" Shin Manting sobbed. "You don't like me at all, do you?" Her simple and innocent words silenced Shin Luo on. "After reading it, you can go and read the new book. It's also free. The cute, handsome and tough male lead Big Lock. You won't be disappointed after reading it. It's so good." Chapter 2062. How could he not like her? It was precisely because he liked her so much that he was worried about her gains and losses. It was precisely because he loved her so much that he was afraid. Shin Luoan's chest ached, and the burning desire in his body subsided a little. The door of the room was open. Nanny he heard the movement inside and came over to take a look. She was a little worried. But soon she turned around and carried the child. Shin Luo and clearly sensed the movement behind him. He looked at Shin Manting in front of him and sighed softly. He walked up to her and gently held her in his arms. Shin Manting sniffled, raised her hand to wipe her face, and hugged Shin Luo and tightly. "Manting." Shin Luo An's voice sounded a little drawn out with a soft sigh. When Shin Manting heard his voice and felt the clear warmth in front of her, her tears stopped. She buried her cheek in his arms and answered in a nasal voice, "Hubby." It was a greeting in 2 words. Shin Luo and had heard it for several days, but he was still not used to it. He was very happy to hear such an affectionate greeting, which he had longed for a long time, come out of her mouth. Shin Luo and was a little greedy as he gently kissed her hair. Shin Manting was tickled by his kiss. It was a little comfortable but also a little uncomfortable. She couldn't describe the feeling and subconsciously avoided it. Shin Luo and quickly released her and said softly, "I'm a little busy today. I have to go to the laboratory. You and the baby should be good at home." Shin Manting couldn't describe the feeling in her heart. It was a little sour and a little sad. However, his explanation made her feel a little less angry. Shin Manting nodded and put her hands on his shoulders. She stood on her tiptoes and kissed him gently on the lips. She said softly, "Come back soon." Shin Luo and was moved, and his heart was even more shaken. He looked at her deeply and only said one word, "Okay." Shin Manting looked into his eyes and felt that there seemed to be endless information in them. She couldn't understand it, but she could tell that he didn't dislike her. He liked her. Realizing this, Shin Manting smiled through her tears. She glanced at his clothes and said, "Hubby, I learned how to tie a tie yesterday. Shall I tie a tie for you?" Shin Luo and was a little surprised. "Who did you learn it from?" "There's a TV on the phone. I learned from the TV on the phone." As Shin Manting spoke, she walked inside and found a man's tie that had been left and used in the cloakroom for a long time. The light red and dark red checkered tie looked very exquisite and formal. Shin Luo and was wearing very simple clothes. He didn't usually need to wear such formal clothes when he went to the laboratory. But when he saw her pick up her tie, he couldn't help but look forward to it. Looking at her expectant smile and her sparkling big eyes, he couldn't help but smile. He stroked her head and said, "Then I'll go change my clothes." Shin Luo and walked into the cloakroom. As soon as he took off his coat, he saw Shin Manting looking at him with a burning gaze. The fire that had just calmed down was once again easily ignited by her at this moment. His throat tightened and he closed the door uneasily. When he came out, he had already changed into a formal suit. Chapter 2063. Am I handsome? Shen Luo and glanced at his attire and smiled. It's not easy to hear a compliment from you. Hehehe. Shen Manting's eyes sparkled. She tightened her tie and said, if you like it, I'll praise you every day. As he spoke, he hopped forward and said, I'll help you with your tie. She was in high spirits. She stood on her tiptoes and put the tie around his neck. Shen Luo and had never experienced such a feeling. This feeling of being treasured by her, desired by her, fawned over by her. His heart was filled with warmth as he stared at her fixedly with a pair of eyes. Shen Manting's face was flushed as she concentrated on helping him tie his tie. Like this. Shen Manting muttered to herself as she twirled the tie around, but it didn't seem right no matter how hard she tried. How can it be wrong? That's exactly what the TV said. She scratched her head, but when she looked up, she saw that Shen Luo and was looking at her. She didn't know when it started, but that gaze seemed to want to need her deeply. Shen Manting blushed and said, I forgot how to do it. It's okay. Shen Luo and looked at her. Take your time. Shen Manting nodded and continued to work. However, his unwavering determination just now had been defeated. Shen Manting felt her face getting hotter and hotter, and her movements became slower and slower. In the end, she couldn't take it anymore. She stomped her feet and said, Aya, don't keep looking at me. I was so nervous that I didn't know what to do. Shen Luo and chuckled and looked away. Then I won't look at you. Shen Manting didn't believe him and quietly lifted her eyes to peek at him. She realized that Shen Luo and was really not looking at her anymore. It was as if he did not care at all. This feeling made Shen Manting even more unhappy. He flung his necktie and said, Forget it, I can't handle it. Shen Luo and couldn't help but laugh. His heart was surrounded by a thick and sweet feeling. Looking at her little face, which was full of excitement just a moment ago, suddenly looking like a frosted eggplant, he actually felt very satisfied. He couldn't help but hug her. His actions were a little sudden. Shen Manting was shocked and froze. She looked at the frightened expression on his face. Manting. Shen Luo and embraced her and called out softly, Manting. Oh. Shen Manting looked at him timidly and shrank back. She was a little uncertain and asked, Hubby, are you stupid? The smile on Shen Luo An's face widened. He pinched her chin with his palm and swallowed her sweetness. Shen Manting only felt that it was a little sudden, but very quickly, her body seemed to have turned into a pool of spring water, indescribably soft. Shen Luo and gradually moved deeper and deeper, sweeping her out to be with him. His kiss very deep, very heavy. It was deeper and more dizzying than the last time. Shen Manting's hands unconsciously climbed onto his shoulders, and her whole body seemed to have lost all its strength as she hung onto his body. His body was getting closer and closer. Shen Manting could clearly feel his desire and passion. Between her waist and abdomen, a burning hot unknown object was pressing against her. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling that made her a little uncomfortable. Shen Manting was a little curious. She put her hand down and touched it tentatively. In an instant, Shen Luo An's entire body tensed up. Chapter 2064. Shen Luo An's eyes were as deep as the sea, dark and bottomless. Shen Manting vaguely felt a sense of danger, and the sense of danger made her look forward to it. Shen Luo An's tender hands were still resting on the bed, and he was so stiff that he was close to going crazy. Manting. Shen Luo An's voice was low and husky. He pressed against her, and the deep desire in his voice moved her. Honey. Shen Manting suddenly felt a little scared, and she only felt that her palms were getting hotter and hotter. She quickly withdrew her hands, but she heard Shen Luo and say in a low voice, Don't move. Shen Manting was shocked and she didn't dare to move. At the same time, she looked at him in confusion and asked timidly, What? When Shen Luo and saw her like this, he immediately felt an inexplicable sense of guilt. His originally tense body became more and more uncomfortable. Shen Luo and closed his eyes, put her down and said hoarsely, Nothing. When Shen Manting saw that he was about to leave, she felt a little empty in her heart. She held his hand and said, Honey. Shen Luo and was even more angry, and he suppressed the most primitive desire in his heart and looked at her. The lights in the cloakroom were not turned on. Compared to the outside, the light inside was very dim. Shen Manting's eyes seemed to be shining, and she looked at him, pulled his hand and said, You just kissed me so happily. Boom. Her words were like the blazing sun that was shot out of the darkness. In an instant, the light around them suddenly burst, and Shen Luo was even more unable to control himself. He held her hand and pulled her into his arms. Even Shen Luo himself didn't know what he was going to do. It was completely a subconscious action, and when he came to himself, Shen Manting was already in his arms. Shen Manting looked up at Shen Luo. Her pair of big eyes were full of doubt. Looking at Shen Luo, she said softly, "Honey, you look so different today." Shen Luo's throat was even more tight, and he asked hoarsely, "What's different? What's different?" Shen Manting couldn't say it, and facing Shen Luo's burning gaze, her cheeks became even hotter, and she said, "It's different. Everything is different." But when he looked down, he saw the protruding bulge. She couldn't help but reach out and poke him. Shen Luo, who was above her, immediately drew in a sharp breath. "Don't move." Shen Luo's voice was low and hoarse. He seemed to be enduring it. "Don't move." Shen Manting was a little shocked. She quickly withdrew her hand and asked, "Dear, are you feeling unwell?" Uncomfortable. How could he be comfortable when he was already like this? Shen Luo blushed and pressed her hand down. Shen Manting only felt a burning sensation on her skin. She looked up at him in confusion. "If I'm not feeling well, can you help me?" "Of course." Shen Manting looked at him. "I'll go get the medicine from Nanny He." As he spoke, he struggled to get up. But before she could move, Shen Luo pulled her back. "You're my medicine." Shen Manting was stunned and looked at him. Then she said with some fear, "Hubby, are you going to eat me?" Shen Luo's expression deepened. "Can I?" His voice was low and hoarse, and he asked with desire. Shen Manting looked at him and shrank back. She said, I heard that eating human flesh is not good for the body and it's sour. That you're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.